What's your creepiest, real-life, story? When I was little, around 8, I hated going to the dentist. He always made me uncomfortable for some reason. I remember thinking his smile stretched too far and seemed forced, like clowns. Anyway, my mom always came with me, and went back so I wouldn't be scared. One day, my dad had me, divorced parents, and had to take me to the dentist, but tried to make me go back alone so he could sit out in the lobby doing whatever. The assistants had to literally drag me back to the room, and you could hear me screaming and crying down the hall, refusing to sit in the chair. Finally, my dad came back to get me, irritated I'd made a scene. He rescheduled my appointment to when my mom would have me, and we just left. He made a big deal about how bad I was acting and told my mom she was spoiling me and all sorts of things. 2 weeks later, it's on the news that my dentist was charged with child pornography, after molesting children under anesthesia and photographing it. I lived in a small college town and my apartment complex was walking distance from the bar/downtown area. One weekday night, I stepped out on our front porch to smoke a cigarette or two. I was up late studying. I brought my textbook with me and sat down on the stairs while I smoked. A girl, who I had never met but who lived one apartment over but down on the ground floor, came home from downtown. She was by herself, and you could tell from her walk she had been drinking. She got into her apartment and barely got the door closed before some guy, who came out of nowhere, knocked on her door. She opened it and I noticed he introduced himself, which was weird because it was after 2:30 a.m., who comes to a strange girl's apartment at that time. So, I decided to stay outside and pay attention. They ended up talking for over 10 minutes. She later acknowledged how weird the situation was but did not know how to end the conversation. He would do the creepiest things, like he reached up and stroked her hair at least 3 times and would try and slowly inch his way closer to her and the door. I made a point of being loud with my textbook so he would know I was there, and he disappeared as eerily as he had come. We called the cops, and days later they had the girl and me sit with a sketch artist. As soon as the sketch was made public, floods of calls came in. Guy turned out to be a serial rapist who followed lone girls home from bars and pretended to be a cab offering them a ride. This girl just got lucky because she lived so close to the bars, he didn't get a chance to pull the cab routine. TL/DR, creepy creepers followed a neighbor home, probably only left because there was a witness, serial rapist apprehended. When I was little my mom would take me to Kmart and let me wander around the toy section while she shopped, normal in the 70s. One day, as I was playing Simone Says, an old man walked up to me and was making small talk while I played. He eventually told me to come with him and took me by the hand. We walked right down the main center aisle of the store right towards the exit sign in the back. As we crossed the last row, I looked to the right and saw my mom at the end of the row. I told him I saw my mom and had to go. I pulled away my hand and ran down to her. I didn't tell her what happened because I didn't want to get in trouble for going with a stranger. It was several years later that I realized that I had probably narrowly avoided being molested, kidnapped, or worse. When I was a kid, I was always the last kid picked up by the bus driver to go to school. One day I was waiting for the bus by myself and a bus with no kids pulled up. The bus driver smiled and told me to hop on. I just had a bad feeling. I said, "Where are the other kids?" He said, "We will go get them now, just get on." He got pushier but didn't do anything crazy. I just kept saying no and he shrugged and left. The real bus pulled up a few minutes later. I went to school and my parents didn't know until I mentioned it that night. Looking back, they were pretty worried. I remember them scrambling to make a few phone calls. When I was younger my mom would take me and my younger sister to the supermarket with her and let us look at the toy aisle, like maybe 1/5 of an actual aisle, for a couple minutes while she'd go up and down the nearby aisles. I remember one time my sister and I were looking at toys and this one older man started talking to me. He said, "You like those toys, huh?" And I'm sure I responded in the positive, of course. Then he said something I remember verbatim to this very day, over 20 years later, "If you come with me I'd buy you all these toys." Even though I was probably only 7 or 8 I knew about strange danger and told my sister to leave and go find our mom. We walked away and found her, and I never mentioned it to anyone. In a cold winter night in a remote village from Quebec, Canada, in 1990, me and my 2 brothers were asleep. We were 1, 3, and 6 years old. In the middle of the night, someone entered our house without knocking, walked around, and was talking to himself. Our house is 2 miles from the village in a rural area. My father woke up, went to the living room where the guy was. He had a car accident 1 mile from our house with his buddy who died instantly, and his scalp fell in front of his face, so the first time my father saw him, he saw a man with no face. He was drunk and his body was frozen. He was speaking to himself, "Je vais mourir, which means I'm gonna die." The fact that his face was partially frozen might have saved his life, preventing him from losing too much blood. My father took him to the hospital 25 kilometers from our house by car. He did survive. To this day, my father is still blessing the fact that we never woke up during the night with all the noise. When camping with some friends on a hill a few kilometers out in the woods from one of the guy's houses. There are a few hiking/four-wheeling trails in the area that lead up to the hill, so it's known by the locals. It was about midnight, we had a fire going and were just sitting around having a good time, then the guy, there were 4 of us, sitting opposite of me yelled, "Who are you?" I turn around and there's this man, about 6 foot tall, staring at us from the edge of the woods with a big rock in his hand. One guy knocked an arrow in the compound bow we had, the guy across from me grabbed the hatchet and I pulled the knife off my belt. We had no clue what we were doing, but the guy wouldn't say anything to us. He eventually just went back into the woods. No sleep was got that night and we kept a very large fire going. We were partying at a usual party spot by the river, and some dude came out of the woods. He just kept saying weird things like, "You got to watch yourself down here, there are some bad folks around here," and when asked who he was he just said, "I'm nobody." We were all a little sketched out, and basically told the guy to get out. A couple days later a girl went off the rope swing there. Someone put fishing hooks all over the bottom of the rope swing. And it took chunks of flesh out of her leg. Later we found out the dude was just a guy that lived nearby, and although a creepy drunk, he was harmless. There was, probably, an inbred family that lived up the road that he would warn people about. About 5 years later, last year, they beat some kid up with a log and kidnapped some girl at gunpoint and took her on a joyride. Once I was walking my dog in a park in London, Ontario. There are houses that sit on the edge of the park and back onto the Thames River and hiking trails. It was a pretty hot day, and my dog was thirsty, so I took him to the river to drink. We got down to the river and were behind a house with a large privacy fence that sat on the edge of the park. While my dog was drinking I heard loud banging noises coming from the backyard, like a hammer. I thought somebody was building a shed or something. All of a sudden the hammer stops, and a man says, "Shut up. Nobody knows you're here." And the banging began again. I froze in fear, and then ran up the bank back into the park. I was now directly beside said creepy house. A man came out of the backyard gate in fatigues with a rusty old wheelbarrow, heading towards 2 quintessential kidnapping vans parked in front of his house. He noticed me looking at him as I was walking past, set down the wheelbarrow and just stared at me until I was out of the park. I called the police when I got home, and I still have no idea what happened. Last year, a guy came to my house's door around 9 o'clock at night. He knocked and I got my mom, and she went out to see what was up. By the way, we live in a very rural area, so visits that are late are extremely uncommon and strange. The guy talked to my mom about how he was opening a business, asked whether she liked American-made products, then handed her a Clorox container as a sample. He went back to his minivan and opened it to get a vacuum cleaner when my mom saw 5 other men sitting inside. She told me to run and get my phone, since we don't have a landline. I couldn't find it, so I got my knife and stood around the corner. She threw the container outside and told them to get the hell off her property, as well as calling the cops. They peeled out of the driveway, and we never saw the car again. Oh yeah, a quick, and lighter-hearted, addition. 2 months later my mom found a single, bearded guy putting filled garbage bags by the back door. She asked him what the hell he was doing. He responded by saying, "This is for your little girl, my little sister." Again, she told him to get the hell out, then went through the bags. They were filled with garbage, dirty clothes, and empty tampon containers. Edit, I forgot to mention that each of these exchanges occurred at the back door when the light was off. I was born and raised in North Dakota. Back when I was in HS, a group of us would research murders that occurred out in the county. We would then go out to find the scenes and film the exploration at night. This was about 2 years before Blair Witch. It was something to do while we got wasted on beer and teenage thing. Eventually we ran out of places to go, ND equals few people, few murders, and got really good at finding abandoned rural farmsteads by driving dirt roads and looking for signs. Rut roads, deliberate tree groves, and old mailbox posts were common markers. We were out looking when we spotted a tree grove that was out of place, sure sign, and drove through the field and discovered an old, but not too old, house. It had padlocks on the outside doors that were knocked off pretty easily. We dispatched them and entered the kitchen. There were 6 of us, all with flashlights, and we lit up the kitchen/dining area fairly easily. The table was the initial thing you noticed, and it was strange because of how normal it looked. It was set for a meal and not a bowl was out of place. The only thing was, we'd been in dozens of these houses and place settings were a first. Especially unbroken ones. As we investigated the area we found the fridge had the disgusting remnants of full stock, and the cupboards were full of canned and dry foods. This was also a first. One guy found mail on the counter from early June 1978, and another found a creepy TV guide in the living room with UFOs on the cover. All the family photos were hanging up. Mom, Dad, Bro, and Sis in their 1970s glory. Furniture was dusty, but in good condition. The closets were full. Everything was totally normal. Which was super abnormal. As we dug around the house, we all started to realize that this house had not been moved out of, it had been straight up abandoned. Imagine locking the door to your house and never coming back. That's the state this house was in. Complete unplanned departure. We went upstairs and split into 3 pairs to check out the 3 rooms. Ours was the closest and obviously it was the younger boy's room. I can't describe what it looked like too well because almost right away from the hall, we heard the most terrifying scream I've ever had the misfortune of hearing. We went running into the hallway and were all yelling questions at each other at the same time. After a few, really long, seconds the 2 screamers caught their breath and said, "You have to go in and see." Walking down the hall and through the doorway, I prayed I wouldn't act like a pussy in front of my friends. I shouldn't have been concerned because the others were as scared as I was. The room itself opened up to the left of the doorframe and centered on the right side of the room was a queen-sized bed. Propped up on pillows, with the blanket drawn to the waist, arms on top of the blanket, and worst of all, head turned slightly so it was looking for you straight in the eyes when you entered the room was a life-sized porcelain doll. Snow-white skin, jet black hair, cold dead eyes. The dead eyes lit up with our flashlights. Like she was waiting for us. If the head hadn't been turned I could excuse it, but it was turned. Ready for when we walked in. Ready for 20 years. Hasty exits were made down the stairs and into the car. It was during the ride we started to get even more creeped out when we realized that even though the house had been abandoned, someone had taken the time to set up that doll. Not packing food, clothes, or family photos. Setting up the doll was one of the last things done in this house. We researched their names but got nothing. No tragic car accident. No grisly massacre. No extended family. Just a tacky time capsule in the middle of nowhere. We found out that the county had taken possession of the land for non-payment of taxes, explaining the locks, but never tracked down any more information on what happened to them. Or why they left that doll. Me and my friends explored an abandoned house recently that seemed to be abandoned in a similar way. We entered through the garage, which still stored a family's items. Some items I remember are a nice fishing boat with a cover on it, a snowblower, the metal cage things people around here put around plants to stop animals from eating them, and there was an old straight-six engine in the corner with the head taken off. One wall of the garage looked to have collapsed in. At the back of the garage was a tiny room with a workbench where the head of the engine from the garage sat with the valve train half taken apart. Just beside the tiny workroom were the stairs to the first floor. Everything was covered in a half-inch thick layer of black rottenness. All the items were still in the house, but many of the shelves had fallen over, and many things were broken. The only really creepy thing was a teddy bear face down on the ground, with its back somehow absent from the layer of black rotten. My friend then put his foot through the floor, so we got out of there. I bet the top floor was more interesting, but the floors were very rotten. Working as a paramedic, I was dispatched to what went out as a simple assault call in a bad neighborhood. This was around 10 p.m. We arrived at the address to find a man standing behind a row of parallel parked cars in front of his house, yelling in a strange high-pitched voice. The police were trying to calm him down. Our first assumption walking up to him was that this was the guy who was injured, but once we got to the gurney around the parked cars we saw what was really going on. A dead man was leaned up against a Mini Cooper, slouched in the gutter. I'll never forget going around the car to find him. There was this really unsettling moment that lasted about 2 seconds where I thought he was alive and staring at me, then realizing he was looking through me, then realizing he was dead. He was shirtless and had been stabbed multiple times. And these were brutal wounds. Most stabbings I'd seen up till that point seemed to be simple penetrations, but this guy's chest and abdomen had been torn to shreds. It was nasty. The guy standing on the curb was yelling in that weird warbly voice, crying, asking if his roommate would be okay. We started CPR and scooped him up and took him to the hospital, knowing that there really was no chance for this guy. After the doctor pronounced him, a couple of cops came over from the scene to square away business involving the victim. One of them really dropped a bomb on us. The story they had heard before our arrival was that the victim had left the house to have a smoke, and when his roommate came out to check on him, he found him stabbed to death outside. But after we left for the hospital, someone noticed a trail of blood leading from the house to the curb, implying that he had been stabbed inside. When the police confronted the roommate about this, he managed to run inside and barricade himself in the house. There was actually a SWAT team over there dealing with the situation as we spoke. So anyway, the person who had most likely brutally murdered our patient that night had been standing there right behind me for most of the call. Pretty creepy. My grandfather owns several forests around the village he lives in, and he drives through them every week, to check how the trees are doing and whether something needs to be fixed. He really loves his trees and has a sharp eye for any potential sickness or insect that could pose a threat. A decade or two ago, hitchhikers were very common. Even in the thinly populated areas of Bavaria, he encountered them regularly, and was always happy to help. He literally picked up every single hitchhiker he found. One day, however, he had a bad feeling about one. Without any reason, he dismissed this one hitchhiker standing on the side of the path. Later that day, there was a radio broadcast about a previously convicted murderer who killed someone in the woods and got caught trying to flee by hopping onto someone's car. Just writing this down makes me shudder again. A few years back I rented an apartment from a friend of mine. He had recently bought it and had it completely renovated. He put it up for sale but couldn't find a buyer, so I offered to rent it in the meantime. After moving in I realized there was something wrong with the lady next door. She was about 45 but looked much older. She would sit up all night listening to Christian radio shows and talking loudly to someone. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep, so I went over to her place and asked her to keep it down. She opened her door, and I got a quick peek. Her walls all had crosses painted on them in different colors. And words like Jesus and angels scribbled everywhere. The windows were painted black, letting no light in at all. It was damp, yellow-stained 50-year-old carpets. No dog though. I asked her to please keep it down. She just looked at me and shut the door. Then she turned up the radio even louder. The next night I had my GF staying over. I wake up in the middle of the night and see the shadow of a person next to the bed looking at us sleeping. I think I'm hallucinating, as I usually do in the dark when I'm sleepy. But then the shadow starts talking. It's my neighbor and she's holding something in her hand. She broke in during the night and who knows how long she stood there. You should lock your door at night, she says, and walks out. The next morning, I heard someone making strange noises below my bedroom window. It's my neighbor talking to herself in tongue. She has a plastic bag in her hand with her rotting dead dog inside. It's hot as hell outside and I can smell death from the bag. At this point I'm scared. She's obviously very insane. I go upstairs and knock on another person's door and ask what the hell is going on. The guy is as scared as me. Apparently she broke into his apartment one evening as well while he was watching TV with his kids. He got up from the couch to get a snack only to find her behind the couch staring at him holding a power drill. Now I know what was in her hand. At this stage I'm basically pooping myself. I called the cops, and they knew all about her. Apparently she is a violent schizo and she hasn't taken her meds. But they can't force her or enter her apartment without her permission because she owns it. The only thing they can do is get her when she goes outside. I sat up for the next 2 days waiting for her to run out of cigarettes. When I hear her leave at 2 a.m. to go across the road to the 7-Eleven, I call the cops. They have 3 cars and a special van over in less than 2 minutes. They restrain her and throw her in the van and drive off to some institution, and in less than a minute it's like she was never there. I will never see her again. Still have nightmares about her looking at me in my sleep. When I was 12 or 13 we went to a McDonald's on the way to the beach. I went to pee before I ate and to wash my hands. Just as I started peeing, this guy comes in, walks to the urinal next to me and just watches. Don't pee. Just watch. I can see him out of the corner of my eye, his eyes locked onto my junk, what there was of it. I had a bathing suit on, so I'm doing the whole junk flop over thing. Guys know what that means, so I can't hide it. I can't stop it. I can now though, not sure why when you're a kid you can't stop your pee. He just smiled creepily as I finished, put things away and washed my hands. He just stood there smiling. I gave him one more look as I left the bathroom and never saw him again. I was with my friend's mom, and I didn't say anything because I didn't want to get in trouble and really wanted to go to the beach. That logic makes no sense, I realize that now, but I ate my filet-o-fish with a WTF look on my face and had an awesome day at the beach. A couple of years back my best friend and I went on a road trip to the States for a music festival. Met up with some friends, saw lots of things and whatnot. One of our friends came back home with us. He needed to get back home for school and his buddies didn't want to head home yet. We decided to drive straight home in shifts, took 24 hours for the full drive. Anyway, my story starts where I am driving, night shift at about 2 a.m. It is a beautifully clear night, full moon, no clouds, middle of the summer party type night. While noticing all of these conditions, I also notice we have followed the GPS onto a back road and driven into a huge valley. Open fields, not another car or house in sight, and it is important to note that we have not seen anyone or anything relating to human presence for a few hours. Upon entering this valley, we lose our satellite signal. We have no satellite radio, no GPS, and no cell signal. Cool beans don't really matter as I know we follow this road for a couple more hours. About 20 minutes after entering this valley and after losing all our connections, we come upon a bridge. As we got closer I saw a car pulled out on the side of the road. Not uncommon, people sleep in pullouts when they can. What is uncommon is this car has all of its windows blacked out. With all of the light from the moon we should have been able to see at least partially inside, but it was completely black. Getting closer we also realize that it has no license plate that we can see. No big deal, we assumed that it is abandoned out here in the boonies, that is until we pass this vehicle and almost immediately its lights turn on, and it pulls out behind us on the road. Now this is where it gets creepy. This vehicle starts tailgating us, in the middle of nowhere, and we can't see who is inside or anything. Again, we brush it off, maybe he is lost, needs to follow someone out of the area? Doesn't explain the windows being blacked out or the lack of a license plate, however. Anyway, with this car following us I start to get an uneasy feeling. Subtle at first, but growing stronger. Soon I get an all-out get the it away from this vehicle ASAP feeling. I find it important to note that I do not get frightened easily, I do not panic, and I only have ever gotten this feeling in times when I know my life is in danger. I push these feelings aside, as it seems like the silliest response to a possibly explainable situation that is until I see something in the middle of the road. Almost on cue, this car backs off, as I and my companions, one of whom was asleep beforehand, try to make out what is in the middle of the road. Coming closer we see what looks to be a body lying in the middle of the lanes. This is not a big road, and like I said it was also a back road, still paved, but very small. At this moment and at the sight of what appears to be a body in the road ahead, we start freaking out. I, in no way am stopping for no one in this desolate and isolated area. There are no other vehicles around other than the one following us, and I can see no housing or lights for as far as the eye can see. No cell service, no satellite, nothing. I quickly tell the others that I am not stopping, and I am going around or through. By this time, we are almost on it. There is no room to go around as there are no shoulders on the road and deep ditches on the sides. And we are close enough to see now that it is a scarecrow, and I drive over top and onwards. This car, small enough to go around it, continues to follow. I speed up, it speeds up, I slow down, it slows down. Until I punch it. After about 2 minutes of this, the car slows down, does a U-turn and drives back. Now my passenger turns to me and says, "I swear I saw spikes in that thing." Lucky for us, we were driving a huge truck, the wheel span was bigger than the scarecrow on the road and we never even touched it. It was another half hour before we reached cell services and the satellite picked back up. It wasn't until we reached home at 5 a.m. that we remembered. During this time, there had been a couple of missing people reported in our province, ones who were on vacation and driving home from the States who never made it home or were ever found. I, and my passengers fully believe that we escaped some crazy Wolf Creek type of death for ourselves. Anyway, that's my crappy story, 100% true. Sorry for how long it was. To answer the questions about police, yes, we contacted the police about it and ended up making a full police report, however we were unable to pinpoint the exact location. There wasn't anything they could really do other than file the report. We definitely didn't want this to happen to anyone else as it was creepy as hell. This happened to a friend of mine's housemate during their time at university. It was at the house she lived in before moving in with my friend after this event occurred. During her second year at university, she lived in a house with 3 other people. At Easter, everyone went back home to their parents for the Easter holidays. Her first night back after returning from the Easter break, she woke up in the morning to find some things moved about in her bedroom. She thought nothing of it and put it down to moving it herself the night before and not remembering. She woke up the next morning to see more stuff moved around. Like her TV and chair etc. She started to get a bit scared and told her housemates to quit moving her stuff about as it wasn't funny and very creepy. They all said they didn't touch anything. The next morning even more stuff had been moved and she started to get very worried. Again, she told her housemate to stop, but they swore they hadn't touched anything and were getting very concerned about themselves. The 4th night she woke up during the middle of the night. She looked over and in the darkness she could see a figure sitting at her desk. She freaked, ran out of the room, locked the door, and called the police. The police turned up and they unlocked the door. Sure enough, there is a guy there, probably in his early 20s, sitting at her desk. Calm as anything. The police arrest him and take him away. A couple of days later they find out that the guy was actually a mentally handicapped person who lived at a care home not far down the road. His mother, who was his full-time career, had looked after him until her death a year or so earlier when he was then moved into the home. He's been a missing person for a few weeks now and it turned out that the house this girl and her friends lived in used to be his and his mother's house. In particular, her bedroom used to be his. He eventually told the police that when he ran away from the home, his old house was where he went to. He managed to get in somehow and spent the whole time there. 2.5 weeks. Sleeping under the girl's bed. Coming out at night while she slept to move her stuff, so it was like how he had it when it was his bedroom. Safe to say, she moved straight out of there and that's when she moved in with my friend. About 6 years ago, I was in my final year of high school and due to the weird timetable the 12th grade had at my school, we regularly had 2+ hour breaks between classes, early finishes, and longer lunch breaks. My house was about a 20-minute walk away from school, and I would usually just walk home either by myself or with a friend and chill until we had to head back. My school was located on the outskirts of the city, and my house a little bit further out. I lived on about 40 acres on a dirt road. Along the dirt road, I had been passing a really foul smell about 5 minutes away from my house. I couldn't tell where the smell was coming from, but it was definitely close to the road. I had passed this smell about 4 times over roughly a week of school but figured it was a dead animal due to the area. After an exam, I was walking home with a friend and the smell was worse than ever, so as you do, we decided to walk into the grass to search for whatever the smell was. We ended up finding a black garbage bag that was completely blown up like a balloon about 5 meters from the road. As a joke, I threw a rock at it and it popped and shot out this foul white goo, and immediately, my friend and I started dry reaching. We ran away as fast as we could, laughing and vomiting, back home to my place. I didn't think anything of it as I figured it was a cat or something that someone had dumped. I remember walking back from school the next week, by myself, and there were mounted police on their horses walking down the road slowly, and near one of the entrances to my property, there was a dog squad with sniffer dogs walking around. I didn't take much notice of all the police and what they were doing, but literally as soon as I got closer to the area that we had found the bag, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach, and I thought, oh shit. The bag ended up being the body of a girl who had been murdered and was dumped along the fence line of my property. I still feel sick when I think about it. When I was about 10, my family of 6 lived in an extremely small apartment. 2 bedrooms upstairs and then the living room. When I was tired of my siblings, I would sleep downstairs. One night I was lying on the couch facing the front door and watching the sky through the window by the door when a face showed up in the window illuminated by a lighter. I freeze, and the face goes away. I'm pretty relieved, thinking it was maybe our druggy neighbors seeing if my parents were still awake when it shows up again. I tried to scream, but when I poured my mouth nothing came out, not a sound. The person then kicks in the door and walks in the room. He sees me, smiles, and goes towards the kitchen. As he comes out of the kitchen with a knife, my dad makes it down the stairs and the guy book it out of there. I still can't sleep easily on couches to this day. But I was walking through a ravine with my best friend when we were kids. We spent the summers up near Saugatuck, Michigan, and would go out on our own all the time to hike through the rivers and ravines that were around that area. We hiked for about an hour through the shallow water and looked for cool rocks and other things in the river. We came across a large black cord-looking thing and my friend picked it up. He immediately became frozen and had a very scary look on his face. I had no idea what was going on and was only in 5th grade, so didn't know that he had picked up a high voltage wire and his body was locked in place. He couldn't move and couldn't do anything but just stand there with all this electricity flowing through his body. I almost grabbed the big wire to take it out of his hand, but something made me not do that. I picked up a big rock and threw it down in his hands to knock the huge wire onto the ground. This worked. He immediately came back to reality, but was obviously out of it. He sat down for a while and finally we decided to walk back to our summer house. We never told anyone, but I realized that if I had gone to pick up that wire we both would have been locked in place in that ravine, and I have no idea what would have happened. I have no idea why I stopped grabbing the wire from him, but I am glad I somehow was smart enough to think about it before I did anything. When I was about 6, a car drove by my house while I was outside on a slip and slide with my next door neighbor. The car slowed down when he got close to me, rolled down his window and started talking to me, but he was talking kind of quiet to where I couldn't make out what he was saying, so I walked closer and he asks, "Don't you go to the school down the street?" I said, "Oh yeah." "Why?" "Because my son said he recognized you." I heard the car door unlock and there was a man in his mid-30s sitting in the back seat. Right as the door started to open I felt someone grab me by the collar of shirt and yank me into their arms. It was my neighbor's mom. She dragged me all the way back to her house and as soon as the driver saw her, he peeled off. When we got back to the house she called the cops immediately. I didn't even realize how close I was to getting kidnapped until I saw my mom crying when she heard about what happened. Not very many creepy things happened to me, so sorry if this story is a bit dull, but it did freak me out a little at the time. A few years ago, when I was 14 or so, I was out walking my dog, a Hyper Chesapeake Retriever mix, in a rural/suburban area. It was a fairly quiet road. A car would breeze once every 5 minutes or so. An old gray Toyota Corolla or some car like that passed by. Nothing unusual. But a minute later, this car passes again. And the car slows down a ton when it's coming toward me, giving me the impression this guy was checking me out. This guy ends up passing up and down the road stalking me. I end up faking having a cell phone and talking to someone on the other end in case he got any ideas. The dog gave me a sense of security too. After maybe the 6th or 7th time this guy does this, I duck into the woods to hide. He swings by twice more, and I wait 10 minutes to see if he comes back. He doesn't. I end up running back home, with a very confused and disappointed dog. I think later on there was a news story that matched my stalker's description and was charged with attempted to hurt. Could be wrong though. Still, creepy. I didn't go for a walk for about a week after that. When I was in middle school, my friends and I were hanging out on a trampoline in the backyard late at night, maybe like 11 p.m. or so. The backyards are all connecting, meaning there are trees and small fences separating them, but you can walk through them. Some guy comes through and asks if we have seen a little orange tabby cat, and we told him no. He said he lives around the corner, if we see it he will give us a reward. Okay, cool. We think nothing of it and go back to talking about Pokemon cards and why Charizard is a god on paper. No joke, 2 minutes after this guy leaves, this little car wanders through and we think, is that the cat he was talking about? My friend grabs it and we all proudly march to the guy's house to collect our reward. The guy is sitting on his front porch, and we bring the cat to him. He's so excited and says, "Oh, I have the reward inside, just come in and I'll give it to you." We were kinda sketched out, but we decided to go in and to stay. He says, "Oh, if you don't come in I can only give the reward to the ones that come in." He was gonna give us $100 a person to go in. Still, we had 2 guys go in and take what felt like forever, but they came out and had $200 with them. They said there was plastic on everything in there and something felt wrong. I feel as though if we all went we would have been killed. But keeping 2 outside that knew where their friends were, I guess, was enough to deter him. Still was a weird occurrence. So, me and my friend decide to go explore this old group of houses, probably from 1930s. Anyway, the main house has 3 stories and is so overgrown a fully grown tree is blocking the door. Naturally, the only other way to get in is through the cellar doors. So, we went down using nothing but our phone lights, and it wasn't really creepy at all, although the ceiling was low, about 5 feet high. So, we go to the second floor and once again, there is nothing. No furniture or trash, just nothing, so we go upstairs and it's the same story. However, at this point the 2 of us realize the place is spotless and has none of the normal dust and dirt. Nope, it was immaculate, which is creepy in itself. So, we go upstairs and nothing once again. We do, however, notice a piece of plywood has been screwed into the wall, and so obviously we rip it off to see what lies behind. What we found was the stairs to the attic. When we went to the attic there was a single chair sitting facing out of the only window in the attic. So, I'm superstitious and scared, but my friend sits down in the fair and realizes that it's placed facing the roller rink across the highway. Pretty creepy. I have more stories about the other buildings on the property if you guys want edit. Well, thank you guys for all the interest. Went to bed and woke up to this. Story 1. So the other large building in the complex looked almost exactly the same as the first. When we went in, however, this time through the front door, we found nothing but conveyor belts and hooks hanging everywhere. The creepy thing? It was once again spotless except for the rust developing on the chains of the hooks hanging above the conveyor belts. So, we fog upstairs, and it is filled with red leather books entitled The Book of Knowledge. Another story behind how this was particularly interesting to me, dealing with another abandoned house. We then went up into the attic and once again there was another chair sitting up there, but this time facing the steps we had just come up. The other thing was it was surrounded by fox skulls. So, we scramble down the stairs and figure we still have to check the basement. When we go down there it is filled with toys. Many of the toys were outside types of toys, Tonka trucks and such, so odd, but not creepy. Story 2. So after we leave the chicken processing house, we decided to check out all of the campers on the property, about 5 in total, and none of them are standing upright. They are all leaning against trees, on their side, or upside down, so we go into the first and largest one, about maybe 25 feet long, and it is filled with newspapers. My friend picked one up and realized it was dated 2013, this was last year, and at that point we noped it out of there. We plan on going back this weekend actually, so I may have new stories. I was walking home from the bar, and I stopped at what I thought was a safe spot to squat down and do a pee in the bushes. Obviously I had scoped out the spot poorly because not halfway through my pee I looked up to my left and about 10 feet away was a homeless man. We locked our eyes while I was peeing. He told me that we were lovers. I said K. He then told me he had been following me for the last 6 blocks, at which point I cut the stream and pulled my pants up and started to walk swiftly to my house, and then he said something referencing his genitals and I started to run. coming home late from a friend's house in a really bad area of Los Angeles. I mean, these streets were gang infested, so I used to walk around with a hammer in my waist because I couldn't get a gun. An old station wagon with all the windows blocked out by aluminum foil pulls up. An old man looks at me and uses his hand to beckon me to come in. I showed him the hammer, he just keeps beckoning. I got the creeps and started running and cut through a park, and he was already waiting for me. I had to jump a couple of fences to lose him. He looked like a weirdo and the scariest ever. This happened to my wife during college. She lived on campus in a more remote mountainous area. One night, maybe 8 or 9, she and a few classmates decide to take a nice peaceful walk up the mountain road past the college. They've been walking for 10 minutes, when suddenly car lights flick on in the darkness at the side of the road and a vehicle comes screeching past them. 2 seconds pass and a half-naked girl comes running out of the darkness shrieking. My wife, terrified, runs the other way back to the college. Luckily the others stayed with the girl and helped her. Seems she had just been abducted and then dropped off in a remote area in the night.
When I was 8, I had a friend spending the night one night. It was super late. Adu was playing Barbies in the living room. I then suddenly got the feeling like we were being watched. I looked to my right, and there in the window stood a man. I remember everything about him to this day. This was a little over 20 years ago. He was a white man. I could tell, because he was wearing a short-sleeved, dark blue t-shirt that had a little pocket on the chest. His arms were very hairy. He also wore black gloves and a black ski mask. He had his hands cupped on either side of his face, so as to block any glare from the streetlights to get a better view of us. I yelped and curled into a ball. My friend saw him and did the same thing. She asked me what we were gonna do. I said, at the count of 3, we're gonna run upstairs and get my dad. I got to 2 and took off. My friend was right behind me. We barged into my dad's room and told him what we saw. He leapt out of bed and ran outside, but the guy was gone. Found out years later that there was a rapist on the loose in that area at that time. Was he the rapist? I don't know. But I don't like my curtains open at night anymore. When I was in like 4th or 5th grade, I lived with my mom and her GF in a 2-bedroom apartment. Well, we had strange things sort of happen around the house, but I was young, imaginative. Well, one day we woke up, my mom's GF woke up, and soon I was shaken awake. What did you do to the kitchen? I was like, I stay in my room pretty much all the time. She yanks me out of bed and drags me by my arm to the kitchen. My mom is standing in the doorway of their bedroom right next to mine. I look and see cocoa powder all over the counter. Like Nesquik. Now, we were pretty poor back then, like, my meal at school was 75% of what I got to eat in a day. I swore up and down I didn't do it, but as I got closer there were little handprints all in the cocoa. Smearing and smacking it everywhere, on the cupboards, the fridge. It was on the floor even, with little footprints. My hands were clean, my feet were clean. But I was the only child in the house, and they sure as hell didn't think someone broke in, or hell not even a ghost. I got a pretty good spanking for that. Oh, you ghost.
I had just moved to a new city and was living on my own for the first time. I worked late night shifts at my job and rode a bike home a fair distance. It was about 1 a.m. and I was riding my bike home when I began to approach the local elementary school. The school was on the opposite side of the street, lit up from the inside by those orange lights they turn on at night. As I began to approach the school, I noticed something strange. I couldn't really make it out, but something seemed off. I stared hard, squinting to see it better as I got closer and closer. Then, as the school was directly across from me, I saw a little girl standing inside the school, staring out the door at me. After a few moments I kinda got a grip and looked back over my shoulder, and there she was, standing on the sidewalk staring at me. I rode home like a bat out of hell and avoided that street like the plague for weeks. Then, one day I worked a day shift and figured, hey, it can't hurt to bike down that street during the day. So yeah, turns out during the day they have these 2 wooden cutouts of kids they put up to mark the crosswalk. At night they store them just inside the door. I had seen the one inside the school and not noticed the one that apparently was forgotten and left outside until later, making it appear as though the same child had been in both spots. The best way to start this story is to describe myself a little. I'm a large man with a shaved head and a pretty long goatee. I look a little like Bam Bam Bigelow without the tattoos or the spandex. For a long time, I lived on my own in an apartment. One day a small Asian girl moved in upstairs. One night after working a late shift I came home, and it was raining pretty heavily. When I pulled into my parking space I noticed the lady had left her window down on her car. So even though I was pretty tired and soaked to the bone I went upstairs and knocked on her door. The blinds in the window next to the door parted and I saw a little pair of eyes look at me then go wide as saucers. Next thing I know I hear the chain go on the door and the lights go out. Then it struck me, late at night in the rain a large man she doesn't know knocks on her door. I left a note on her door that said, "Your car window is down." I figure she probably spent all night hiding in a corner. At about 2 a.m. our neighbor rang our doorbell and was banging on the door. My dad opened the door, and she said something about her brother, who was mentally handicapped, murdering her parents and locking her in the closet. He thought she was just having a nightmare, but it turns out she was telling the truth. Cops were called, the guy is in the insane asylum now. My neighbor still lives in that house. I was walking with my older brother one night we were returning from a game he had. It was probably 9 to 10 at the time, I was maybe 10. For some perspective, I'm now 18 going on 19 in a month. We were approaching the apartment building I live at, and we saw a figure. He was probably the size of an average man. Not surprisingly the darkness conceals his upper body, including his face. We stopped dead in our tracks usually, security guards patrol the grounds at this time, but their rounds start at 11. This really shouldn't have scared us, but he started to run toward us. Sprint. He was running really fast at us. My older brother screamed at me to run. He chased us for an entire length of a street, until my older brother told me to go under a fence that is arching above the ground, perfect for our sizes. We were scared as we saw him try to climb over the fence, but luckily we were very close to home. A week later, we found out that a child went missing the night after we escaped. To this day, the child has never been found. TLDR, my older brother and I were almost nabbed by a potential kidnapper. Barely escaped.
This was about 10 years ago when I was 15, female for reference. My family owned an ice cream store and I had been working very late. It was about 1:30 a.m. when I was leaving to catch the last bus home. I got to the stop and had to wait 11 minutes for it. This was a reasonably safe area, the only issue was there were lots of bars, lots of drunk people. There were two guys at the bus stop, one that looked about 20 and the other was middle-aged. That's all I remember about him. When I arrived, the younger man moved to sit in front of some bushes about 20 feet away. The older man came and sat on the bench right next to me. He made small talk, nothing exciting, but clearly very drunk. He told me that his friend had drank too much and they needed my help. He told me to go make sure his friend was drowning in his own vomit. I looked over to the younger man, but now he was sitting in the bush. Actually in it. I told the older man that all I could do is call an ambulance, but he of course refused. At this point I was horrified. There was no one else in sight, so I stood up and moved towards the street lights, because they can't kill you if you're standing under a light. This is when he got agitated. He started demanding that I go to his friend in the bushes. I knew this wasn't good. The bus was still 6 minutes away. I looked around for someone to help me, but he knew what I was doing. I was holding a sundae cup filled with Smarties, from the ice cream shop. From here on everything is a little fuzzy. I remember that he smacked the cup out of my hands, then grabbed my arm. That's when I saw salvation. There was a small bundle of cars starting to come around the corner. I ripped out of his grip and tried to jump into the street, hoping someone would stop. But even as drunk as he was still faster than me. He tackled me to the ground, hiding me from the traffic. He picked me up from behind with my arms pinned to my chest. He started carrying me to the bushes. I kicked and screamed as loud as I could, but I was really overpowered. I remember getting to the bushes and being grabbed by his friend. I knew I was about to be hurt. The next few seconds are the fuzziest. I heard tires screeching and men yelling. I was thrown to the ground with anarchy around me. I don't know how many people were there. Next thing I know, I'm being carried like a baby onto the bus that showed up early. Possibly the only reason I'm alive. I remember looking out the window and seeing maybe 5 or 6 men, bus passengers, kicking it out of the 2 men. I lost consciousness at this point, a mix of stress, shock, and a concussion I received at some point. I was taken to the hospital and both men were arrested on scene. I was never asked to testify, but an officer visited me a few months later to tell me they had both been sentenced to 14 years for this and other crimes. My heart has never beat as fast as it did that evening. TLDR, 2 men tried to hurt me in a bush at a bus stop. Bus showed up just in time. Both men were arrested and put in jail for 14 years. This happened a couple of nights ago. I know this is going to sound completely fake, but I swear to my soon-to-be child that this actually happened. It's around 12:30 and we're hanging out around my town. As a group of college kids, there's not a lot to do at night around where we live, so this is pretty much all we do. Anyway, what seems to be out of nowhere, an extremely drunk man comes stumbling towards us. He asks us, "Can you help me find my house?" This guy is wearing overalls and a trucker hat. And that's it. So, already sketchy. I'm about to say no when one of the girls we're with says, "Yeah, sure. We'll help you find your house." So now, we have to walk this guy all the way to his house. We begin our walk, and all the way this guy stumbles along the street, telling us all the kinds of alcohol he has at his house and whether we want to come drink with him. We tried to change the topic, so I asked him, "So, what are your plans for tonight?" And his answer scares me just thinking about it. He literally, right to our faces, says, "Oh, I'm just gonna kidnap and kill 3 kids." Right. To our ducking faces. So, as you can imagine, at this point I'm really on edge about this drunk overall wearing psycho that we're leading to his house. After about 20 minutes of walking, we finally reach his house, and this thing is straight out of a horror movie. It's a pink, Victorian-era house. It looks like a murder house if I have ever seen one. Anyway, the guy thanks us and starts asking us if we're sure we don't want to come in and drink with him. The girl that initially decided we would take him back to his house politely declines, and he starts walking towards her, getting more insistent. So, she turns around and promptly speed walks away. I yell at the guy while he keeps trying to convince us to come in, and we start running away from him back the way we came from. He didn't chase us, but it's terrifying to think what he was really up to. I honestly believe that he was faking drunk. If we would have been stupid enough and accepted his invitation, I honestly believe something would have happened to us. This guy was crazy. Acting drunk, trying to lure kids into his house with promises of alcohol. Something wasn't right. So that's my story. TLDR, super drunk overall wearing maniac tries to lure us into his house with alcohol after he tells us he plans to kidnap and kill 3 kids. Probably wasn't drunk, probably wanted to kill us. We noped the duck out of Naperville. My parents bought a cabin in the Washington Mountain Range, BA. My mother and sister would go there and spend weekends. I remember my mother talking about how they would wake up and the side door of the cabin would be open. They changed the locks, but it continued. What was odd was we never arrived to find the door open. It only opened when someone was staying in the cabin. Summer or winter didn't matter. I laughed it off, thinking they left it open, or they didn't close it properly, etc. Being young and adventurous, I decided to spend the night in the cabin during the winter. The cabin was not heated but did have electricity and a small wood stove. So, I drove my Jeep out there after work and got to the cabin after dark. I arrived and a light snow had started to fall. I was very cold, and I was already regretting going because it was only 13 degrees Fahrenheit. I quickly lit a fire and stoked it to produce as much heat as possible. I closed the door and locked it, pulling it several times to ensure it was closed and not going to open in the middle of the night. Yes, I was laughing at the stories of it being open in the morning. I climbed into bed and put an extra quilt on to keep me warm. I quickly fell asleep. I had a nightmare. In the nightmare, I dreamed that I woke up and the cabin was ridiculously cold. I walked from the bedroom to light the fire, and I immediately saw the door open and turned 90 degrees to see a tall lizard-like demon with glowing red eyes staring at me. I immediately woke up from the dream and I was, wow, here I am out in the middle of nowhere by myself and I'm having nightmares. Great, I then noticed that it's very cold. So, I climbed out of bed and walked towards the other room to light the fire. As I enter the room, I turn and in the darkness I can see the door is sitting wide open. Snow had blown in on the floor. The nightmare was coming true. The nightmare was playing out exactly, and the next part was to see a large demon. I let out a yell and fumbled for the light switch like a madman. My mind was racing when the lights came on and there was nothing there. I looked at the snow and didn't see any footprints or evidence of tampering. So, in my engineering mind, I assumed the heating of the structure caused some structural shift and the door to pop open. I still didn't go back to the cabin for quite some time. A few years later, a house was built directly across the street. A few months after the new owners moved in, I walked over and introduced myself. We chatted for a little while and I asked how he and the family liked the place. He said they loved the area, but it was taking the kids some time to get used to living in the country. He smiled and said, they're a bit spooked by it all. I asked, spooked? Yeah, they think a monster comes into their room at night. I must have turned as white as a sheet at that point.
I worked as a security guard for a mall. I was stuck with the night shift. The car was broken, so I rode a bike around the outside of the mall. It was about midnight when I heard someone yelling for help and waving his arms towards me. I pedaled like a madman to get over to him. He looked 17 and was poorly dressed for the season, winter. I ask what's wrong and he tells me, my friend won't get up. Alright, let me call someone. Reached for my phone to call 911, but then the guy grabbed onto me, and another man came out of the bushes near us with a gun pointed to my head. Long story short, I got mugged at gunpoint while they handcuffed me with my own handcuffs. Thought I was gonna get dapped. I was at the Grand Canyon a few weeks ago, camping in a tent with some friends. Around 11 o'clock, I was still awake but everyone else was asleep, and suddenly some women started screaming from what sounded like a few campsites over. They weren't joking around, or they were very good actors, they sounded terrified. They screamed for about 10 seconds, at first 2 or 3 of them, then eventually just one. The screaming stopped and I heard someone much closer to our tent start running, then a car door slammed, but the car never started. No one else woke up and I was too scared to move, even to get my phone. I didn't fall asleep until the sun came up. In retrospect, it was probably something like an elk really close to their tent as opposed to, an axe murderer, since this was a decently populated campground, and I didn't hear about any incidents after. When I was 8 or 9, my family took a trip with my dad to Toronto because he was going there for business. He would do this often, take us on trips with him instead of being gone for long periods. We get to this nice hotel, my parents, myself, and my 2 brothers, one 7 and one only 9 months old. The hotel is one of the biggest I'd ever seen at that age. In my opinion, it would be hard to keep running into the same people all day in this complex. The next day, my dad heads off to his appointment, and my mom decides to take us to breakfast. We're at our table in the hotel cafe when this mid-30s/early 40 couple approaches us. Otherwise, unassuming, but their behavior was strange. They offered to feed my youngest brother for my mom while she ate her breakfast. My mom was a bit overprotective with us when I was young, so I was surprised when she acted so calm, but firm, in telling them no thank you. They insisted twice before leaving us to it and exiting the cafe. Later on, my mom was taking us to this shopping complex that was underneath/connected to the hotel. We saw the couple following us through a part of the mall. My mom made us stop and go into a store until they passed us and left. At this point, my 7-year-old brother and I are looking at each other and thinking that this isn't normal. My mom decides that this might be a weird coincidence. A little later, we decided to head back to the hotel and go swimming. The pool is large, so large that it stretches from indoors to outside. While my brother and I are in the water, my mom has the littlest one with her sitting on a deck chair. Lo and behold, the couple is at the pool as well. They're sitting right across the pool from my mom, just staring at her. She told us shortly after that we should leave and go back to the hotel room because my dad would be back soon and wanted to go to dinner. Again, my brother and I are thinking that this is really strange despite how young/naive we were. The best part is when my dad finally does return to the hotel room, he knocks and doesn't announce himself. My brother and I run into the bathroom and close the door to hide because we assumed it was that crazy couple. Growing up, my family lived in a 2-family house on the 2nd floor in a Boston suburb. The layout of the house was this: the front of the house was the living room, the middle was the dining room, and the back was the kitchen. Bedrooms followed along each room. My bedroom was next to the kitchen. The kitchen had a door which led to the back stairs. The door had a bolt on it. As a kid, I used to push my little brother into the stairway and lock him out. He'd push up against the door, he thought I was just pushing it shut, he had no idea I locked the bolt. So, I'd stand there, laughing, but I could hear the wood strain while he pushed on it. So, one night, I'm sleeping and something wakes me up. I hear the creaking back stairs and slow, light footsteps. I woke up more. Initially I thought I was hearing things, but the sounds were real. They stop, and I hear a light creak. Whoever is out there is trying to push the door open. I heard another creak, this time louder. Then the doorknob is jostled while the door strains some more. More silence. I heard someone leave and the screen door squeak open and closed again. I was scared. I quietly got out of bed and woke up my mother. She got mad as I was walking her up. I told her what had happened, and she tried to convince me I was just dreaming. At this point, I'm freaking out and crying because I thought someone was trying to break in when suddenly, bam bam bam, gunshots ring out. I hit the floor. My mom runs for the phone and calls 911. They came from the neighbor's house. The police show up, the neighborhood is lit up with blue spinning lights and the cops are yelling at someone. We stayed far, far away from the windows on that side of the house. After a little while it was quiet. So, my mother went to look out and see what was going on. The police had a guy handcuffed and on the ground. The police entered the neighbor's house only to find the person living there was shot dead. We later learned the guy that was shot was sleeping when the burglar broke in. He woke the guy up. The guy living there got up to check on the noise and got shot by the burglar. It involves an apartment in a complex in Coney Island in the 80s. Seemingly deserted, the man inside invited me over to trade video games, which happened, but inside that apartment. A refrigerator loaded top to bottom with pudding cups. 3 grand pianos covered in canvas tarps stuffed like puzzle pieces in the largest room, barely fitting, had to crawl over or under them, with a full ballroom chandelier. Absolutely no furniture or electric appliances, except the fridge, his computer, and the fan, no lamps, no TV, no toaster, nothing. His bedroom had a bunk bed, he lived alone, and the window had been removed completely and replaced with a massive industrial fan that blew air into the room like a hurricane. This fan would blow floppy disks off the desk, so they were weighted down with pudding cups. He lived on the 13th floor. The man himself was absolutely normal looking. I have no idea how I made it out of there alive. God smiles on fools and madmen, and this story had both. When I was around 13 or 14 or so, I started seeing and hearing weird sounds around my house. I took the bus home from school and my mom always picked up my little brother from middle school, so I was normally the first one home in 30-45-ish minutes. In that time, I would normally sit and start working on my homework. Anyway, one day I started hearing footsteps around the house, when I knew I was home alone. With the way our house was set up, if someone was walking down the stairs I could see them from the living room, where I usually chilled after school, but I never saw anyone there. A few months after hearing invisible people walking around my house, I started seeing things. Every so often, usually around every other week or so, I would see a man in my house at around 6:30 a.m., when I was getting ready for school. We lived in a split-level home with bedrooms on the second floor, and whenever I was walking down the upstairs hall to the bathroom I would always see him downstairs, turning the corner from the living room into the kitchen. The very first time it happened, I sneaked downstairs with no small amount of trepidation, only to find an empty kitchen. Nobody was downstairs. From then on, I chose to ignore the man I saw. He always appeared the same, around the same time. Average height male in his 30s, light brownish blonde hair, green plaid shirt, and khaki pants. It never varied. Although this was a few years before WebMD, I still had the internet, and managed to diagnose myself with schizophrenia. I never told anyone about my visual and auditory hallucinations, for fear of being locked up in an institution. Of course, later diagnoses prove that I am not schizophrenic, but whatever. The point is that I never mentioned what I was seeing and hearing to anyone. About 2 years after I started seeing my family move 2 states away and started a new life. As soon as we moved into the new house, the visions stopped. I never saw or heard anything that didn't seem real again. 2 years after moving, I was touring and interviewing at various colleges. My mom was usually the one to take me out of state for interview, and with that being the case, we often ended up in the car together for 5+ hours straight. On one trip together, the subject of the paranormal came up. During our conversation, I learned that she absolutely believed in ghosts and spirits. I decided this was a good time to mention my past experience, and simply said, "Hey Mom, I know this sounds weird, but I saw some really strange thing in our old house." She immediately turned towards me, looking shocked, and said, "Did you see the man in the green plaid shirt?" Keep in mind, I purposefully never mentioned what I saw to anyone. My mom could describe exactly what I had seen for 2 years without me ever mentioning it to her. It was creepier. Was driving from Atlanta, Georgia to Lexington, South Carolina with my GF to visit my parents. I like to drive at night since there are less people on the road and I can take my time. At around 3 a.m. or so we are having a good time. I had stopped at a gas station and picked up some coffee for us and we were due in about an hour. GF was sleeping soundly and I'm listening to a quiet radio humming away. I started getting a little drowsy and took a sip. The road was just like my coffee, no cars in sight except for a spotted few on the side of the road here and there. In the distance I can make out what looks like a hitchhiker, or what I think is one, but can't really tell due to such low light. As I get closer I start to notice other things, like how the person is kinda thin and tall and completely, for the most part, apparently brown. I'm right up on this thing now, and at about 20 feet it turns around and locks eyes with me as I pass by. This was no person. And it is the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life. It was a deer. Or I tell myself it was. I have seen deer stand on their hind legs to fight, but they still have deer posture when they do. Not only that, but I was watching this thing walk for about 30 seconds from first seeing it in the distance to passing it. The posture it had was human. Standard biped stance. Arms back, chin down. But the worst part was the eyes or lack thereof. In their place were 2 large black pits, almost black holes. I'll never forget the stare down it gave me. The instant I passed it I had the only panic attack I've ever had in my life. I had to wake up my GF to keep calm enough to get to an exit with a large gas station a few miles away. Like hell I was going off a ramp close to that thing. After we pulled into the station I had a complete meltdown. I started crying harder than I ever thought I could. I couldn't talk, breathe, or do anything but curl into a ball and cry. After around 30 minutes or so, she finally gets me to calm down enough to tell her what happened. While I don't think she believed what I think I saw, she knew that I was convinced and legitimately scared. Every rarely I will dream about it and wake up crying or in a cold sweat, and she will tease me about it or roll over and ignore me instead of comforting me about the one thing that I've ever been terrified of. But I know what I saw, and I know it will haunt me for the rest of my life. Some nautical creepiness for you. Maybe more weird than creepy, but it spooked me. I was in the Coast Guard for 4 years, 2 of them spent on a 210-foot cutter homeported in NC, so we did a lot of patrols in the Caribbean, and naturally, we passed through the Bermuda Triangle frequently. Before you call BS or aliens, the Caribbean and anywhere near the Sargasso Sea can be pretty spooky on its own right. I'm talking dead calm conditions where the sea melts into the horizon and it looks like you are trapped in a huge sphere of blue, freak squalls that come up surprisingly quickly, St. Elmo's fire, you name it. Anyways, me and the rest of deck department, would have to stand watch for 4 hours at all times of day, either 4 hours standing up manning the helm or 4 hours up on the flying bridge standing lookout. I was frequently stuck on the 4/8, 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., the very definition of the graveyard watch. So, one night I'm at the helm, in the Bermuda Triangle, and the quartermaster asks me for a compass check, where you look in a little window at the magnetic compass reading, and it's spinning rapidly. It sent a chill down my spine. Never in a million years did I think this actually happened. But there it was spinning away. When I tried to explain to the QM why I couldn't give him a compass check, the GPS computer suddenly went dead, just simply quit. Which is obvious, because it illuminates the QM's desk. The officer of the watch immediately goes up to the flying bridge to make sure there isn't anything metal affecting the compass, and calls the captain on deck, and engineers to fix the computer. It continued like this for the next 45 minutes, with everyone on the bridge on full alert thinking there was a sub tailing the ship, and sonar repeatedly showed nothing. The captain, who is usually super professional, finally goes, "Welp, that's the weirdest thing I've ever seen," and retreats to his cabin. The poor QM had to plot coordinates by dead reckoning until we got to Miami. I have plenty more spooky sea stories I can post later if people are interested. Here's another watch-related one. We were somewhere off the southern coast of Cuba, nearing the Windward Passage. This area is often choppy and windy, and the bottom drops off pretty rapidly, so we expected some rough weather. So, I'm on the 4/8, of course, lookout watch, there's a full moon, cloudless sky, and about 10-foot swells rolling towards us. Nothing too bad, as I don't get seasick. After about 2 hours of watch we must have gotten away from the shipping lanes, because I had lost all my contacts. There were only 1 or 2 freighters just over the horizon that I could see faint superstructure lights off. So needless to say, the watch got boring really quick. Then, on one of my rounds, I realized there is pale cloud just above the horizon dead ahead in thin ribbon, approaching fast. And just below it, I can make out much choppier waters. As it gets closer I realize it's in a halo shape, like from the game Halo, and it's a totally unbroken, solid halo ribbon from horizon to horizon from my left to the right. It's really high up, like cirrus cloud high. And just underneath it, the water gets way choppier, maybe 15 to 20 footers, hard to tell, white caps and long foam streaks. As the cloud gets right overhead, we hit a set of the Three Sisters. Which is a common phenomenon, where larger swells crop up every now and then in 3 regular and much larger swells. Then the wind starts absolutely howling. Like gale force winds, absolutely howling. Now here's where it gets weird. I started having full-blown hallucinations. Terrifying ones. Granted I'm tired as hell, getting windburnt and rocking around constantly, but I'm still standing up, and if I'm nodding off, I'm not noticing it. I saw eyes in my binoculars, the radar dome was breathing, oncoming swells had faces and windows in them, as if they were buildings. One of our wind vanes sheared off the superstructure and fell off into the night. I would later discover that actually happened. The American flag turned into a flock of gulls. One of our Raytheon marine radars, the ones that spin around, became floppy and elongated and flailed about. On several occasions I saw shadow people climbing up the ladder onto the deck or climbing on board from the bow. Then finally, most weirdly of all, I saw Mario poke his head out of the smokestack and spin around, which scared me the most for some reason, before the adrenaline fully snapped me out of it. What was strange was how vivid the hallucinations were. I wasn't on drugs, and they can most certainly be chalked up to the elements, darkness and being tired, but I was standing up straight, eyes wide open. I've never had any similar hallucinations on a watch before or since. Also, I'm sure the weird halo cloud had nothing to do with it, but the setup made everything so much creepier. I could almost feel my adrenal glands pumping out adrenaline. Me and my girlfriend a few years back took a month-long trip driving up the west coast of the US, stopping at national parks and camping along the way. We were on our way to Death Valley a little later in the day around 5 o'clock. We knew the sun would set around 8 o'clock and knew we could get some pretty sweet magic hour shots of the sand dunes if we made it in time. We're photographers. I don't know how much information on Death Valley is common knowledge, but it's known to have the lowest elevation in North America and has no cell phone reception. When you're heading in, it's strongly recommended you let someone know what part of Death Valley you're going, and what time you plan on heading out. If they don't hear from you by that time, they can call dispatch to send someone looking for you. If you're the adventurous type, finding you can be like looking for a needle in a haystack. We made the 2-hour drive at 120 degrees Fahrenheit, windows rolled down and AC off, in case the car overheats, out to the sand dunes just in time to catch the sun going down. Got some great photos. There's something strange about sunsets in Death Valley. There are faint streaks of purple and red haze that glow from the sun setting behind the mountains. It's kind of eerie. We get back to the car in the dark and start our long journey back. Just knowing if one of our tires popped could potentially lead to us being stranded put me on edge a little bit, so I was focused as hell. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed headlights behind us approaching at a pretty fast speed. As they got closer, they started flashing their high beams at us. I figured they wanted to drive around us, so I slightly pulled to the side, but they stuck right behind me, continuing to flash their lights. Now I'm thinking that it's somebody who needs help, and they are asking me to pull over. I slow to a stop, but sure as hell don't get out of the car. They stop behind me. I watch in my rearview mirror as close as possible to get any hint of what's going on. I can now see that it's a minivan, and there's some shuffling going on, but it's too dark to see who's inside. I sat there for a good minute trying to decide what to do. The side door of the van swings open and a light in the van turns on to reveal 5 to 6 teenagers grabbing things from different parts of the van. They were each stepping out of the van into the dark one by one, walking towards the car. My foot hit that gas pedal and the van's headlights were 2 specks within a few seconds. I had no idea what was going on, but we sure as hell weren't going to be part of it. Definitely put us in a weird mood for the night. To start, I'm a straight dude, and I used to work at Victoria's Secret. No, not selling things on the floor stock boy. Pinning security tags on things, moving heavy boxes, climbing ladders, squashing bugs. I thought them kind of feministic for literally saying that last bit in the interview, but they turned out to have some spiders that were about 5 inches wide when you counted the legs, so I kinda understood after seeing that. Killed the thing with a box, 'cause I was worried that if I tried to step on it, it might win. Anyways, back on point. So my manager that day was this lady that was pregnant. As hell. But a very chill pregnant lady handled the pain and the mood swings oddly well. Cheerful and straightforward, at 7 months preggers. This woman comes up for an exchange, no big deal. Manager types up the ticket and goes to take the security tags off the new clothes and the woman cuts her off. Nano nuna nano, don't touch it. Oh, I need to take the tags off so you can leave with it. No, don't touch it, I don't want to get pregnant. You can't get pregnant that way. Please don't touch it, if you touch it and then I touch it I can get pregnant, I don't want to get pregnant. I'll get one of the other girls to help you. So she grabs one of the non-pregnant workers, and gets them to finish out the return. She then comes into the back, because holy shit, that actually just happened, and someone needs to hear about it. So she comes into the back to tell me about it. She has some trouble getting her words together, mostly just making those "I can't believe this just happened" faces. While she's getting herself together to tell this story, none of which I know at this point, Tubbs, and into the employees-only backroom walks in that same lady. She starts to ask a question, but then notices me. Oh, you do have a boy working here. She then proceeds to dump out her newly purchased lingerie on a nearby box. Would you touch it, as she motions to the lingerie? I try to awkwardly laugh it off as though it's a joke. She stares at me unflinchingly. Awkward silence comes over the room as this woman clearly will not leave until I touch her lingerie. I pick it up, fold it neatly, and put it back in her bag. The woman leaves. Manager then proceeds to tell me the previous story about how the woman thought she could catch pregnancy by touching something a pregnant woman touched, and I start to freak out a little. Then why was she so determined to have me touch her lingerie? The woman returned to the store 3 times that day. Each time, making a beeline for the back room, only to be intercepted by my managers, who would politely ask if she needed anything, and then she would leave. I left out the back door that night. Super kudos to the wonderful women that worked there. TLDR, woman thought she could catch pregnancy by touching something a preggers lady touched. Demanded I touch her new undergoes. When I was a kid, my room didn't have curtains or blinds. One night I was trying to sleep, and it looked like a man was outside of my window. I screamed and ran and told my parents, but they didn't believe me, and said it was just a nightmare. I tried to go to sleep, and I brought our dog in my room for protection, but the dog wouldn't stop barking, so my dad took the dog out. Then I saw the gleaming creepy eyes watching me, and upside-down face grinned from outside my window. I screamed, but still my parents didn't believe me. I thought I was going to be murdered all night. The next morning there was yelling and then the cops. Turns out there was a wanted man hiding out on our roof with a bunch of heroin all night, and when he tried to leave in the morning our neighbors saw him climbing off our roof and into his yard. My parents didn't apologize, and they never got me curtains even though I begged. I worked at a campground on the night shift. 12A 8A, every night. It wasn't bad. I would bring in my PS2 and game a good portion of the night, only having to deal with 1 or 2 people on busy nights. It was just me in this little 8-foot by 8-foot shack, with nothing around but dark, all night. My first week there, the other third shift guy who was quitting told me about this payphone a few feet from the shack where I worked. He said it rang every night at 4:17 a.m., just once. It was probably just an automated test call, he guessed. He's never answered it himself. I go for a few months with the job. It was the middle of summer, so most nights I had the windows closed so I couldn't hear the payphone go off. Mid-August I started leaving the windows open during the night. Sure enough, at 4:17 a.m. every morning the phone would ring once. The ring even sounded creepy, like the payphone was submerged in water then put where it sat. One night I got up the nerve to answer it. I set an alarm for 4:15 and would go wait on the phone until it rang. When it did, I answered it. But there was no sound. Just dead air, like someone was on the other line but wasn't answering. I said hello a few times and hung up. I did this every night for a week with the same results. I didn't think anything of it and left it alone after that for about a month. The first week of October, I decided to answer the phone once again. I set my alarm and when the time came, I answered the phone. Hello? Hello? Then I heard what sounded like someone inhaling through clenched teeth. The voice that sounded was rough and sounded like he had gargled gravel. The best comparison I can give is Horace P. Gage from The Suffering. He said my name. My complete name. First, middle, and last. It was a voice I'd never heard. My voice caught in my throat, and I hung up. I rattled some change into the payphone and hit *69. The number had come from California. I live in Indiana. When I was 15, I moved to Utah. It was a smaller town just north of Salt Lake City, and far enough west that the wind would carry in the smell of the lake, and the air would reek of spoiled sea. I got dropped halfway into sophomore year, which was terrible for an awkward kid in a new place, because in Utah they began high school with sophomore year, so I was effectively a freshman twice. The only luck I had was a girl I had met named Sarah, and we started dating right at the end of the school year, so we were able to spend the majority of the summer together. Now, you might not know this about Mormons, and I certainly didn't, but in their church they really like big families. Something about spirits in heaven requiring bodies. So, it wasn't uncommon for some of the more devout Mormon families to have 8, 9, or more kids. It really just meant outdoor freezers packed with hamburger helpers and houses with bigger kitchens. Sarah's family was pretty Mormon, and my family didn't practice much of any religion, so we just never discussed it. She had 6 sisters, 7 in total including her, ranging from 6 years old to 18. I only met her mom once, and she was always pregnant, and I never spoke with her dad. I was a little too overwhelmed by meeting her family and I avoided it. I probably would have figured it out then, but I had only lived in Utah for 6 months and everything already seemed so weird to me. I remember a particular night I had picked her up. She had a curfew that made it so I had to park down the street so she could sneak out. I wanted to jump over a small gully flanked by trees beside her house, but she refused, and we had to walk around, which meant passing by her parents' window. I thought it was weird, but I just assumed she was worried she might get her feet wet. It went like that for a couple months. I would stop down the street, and I would wait while she walked beside the gully, around her house, and up the street to meet me. Sometimes I'd meet her at the road, but I was always careful not to walk too far onto the lawn for fear I'd wake her parents. One night it was raining, and I didn't want her to walk alone through the dark in the rain, so I had planned on surprising her by meeting her by the back door she snuck out through. To save time, and avoid walking by the window, I walked through the trees to the gully. The water was a bit higher and moving quicker than normal because of the rain runoff, but I figured I could make the jump. Man, I was wrong. My feet landed in the mud on the other side, but I sank immediately in the wet earth and splashed backwards hard into the muck. The rush of cold water was a shock and I reached up and grabbed a storm drain, but what I had grabbed dislodged and flowed down with me. The water wasn't very deep, maybe 2 or 3 feet, so I stuck my shoes in it and stood up still holding what turned out to be a black garbage bag. I dropped it and started to crawl up and my hand landed on another black garbage bag. I tried to crawl up, but they kept dislodging in the slick viscous grime. It must have been the 3rd or 4th time I tried to find something to grip onto when I accidentally tore one open. At first I thought it was a rotten orange, black and decaying, among a spoiled nest of old bones. But I could just make it out, yellowed skin bloated on the white bone, it was a skull, tiny, a baby's. I let out a shout, I didn't know what else to do. It smelled awful, and I had an overwhelming urge to get away from it. Quickly, I scrambled up through the mud and kicked myself up against a tree, my heart racing. Sarah was there. She was crying. She had been waiting for me by the street and came over when she heard me shout. She must have always known. I never saw her again, and all of the girls were pulled out of school. The local news report said that her father had decided he had enough kids and had been burying each newborn out by the gully. But they recovered 5 tiny bodies, all girls, and I wonder if he had just been waiting for a son. I was getting ready to go to bed one night quite late, around midnight, after watching TV. I called my dog and went to the backyard. There's no moon and no yard light, so I'm standing in pitch blackness waiting for the dog to wander out before bed, and as I'm standing there I get the strongest feeling that I'm not alone. Not the usual paranoia of standing in the dark, it was more like my brain's proximity alert was going off hard. The hair on the back of my neck raised, my arm hairs started to prickle, the garden was I deathly / I quiet and far too still for comfort. I'm in a state of hyper-awareness, my dog trots out, stops stretching and yawn, but suddenly his ears prick right up. He's a big white bull terrier, 90 pounds dog, so for those who don't know the breed when they catch a scent they find interesting they make a ready stance for an easy pounce. Now, he was the friendliest and calmest bull terrier I ever had. Wouldn't harm a fly, but at this moment his hackles go right up, intently staring into the darkness and growling like a demon, and then he's off, tearing into the blackness barking and growling viciously at the unknown thing. I tell him that I'm going to murder whoever's in my yard and start running into the dark after him swinging but silently praying I don't connect with anything. All this happens in a split second, then I hear a sickening thwack, my poor dog yelps and I see him tearing back to the house with his tail between his legs, and his snout/head is covered in blood. I'm still standing in the darkness, barefoot, my fear turns to anger because who/whatever he is, it's hurt my dog. I stand up straight and yell out I'm going to find you and cut your ducking throat if he's not okay. I hear a bunch of thuds at my wooden gate like someone is climbing it, and then the garden is silent again. I took my chance and bolted inside to find my dog cowering under the couch. I grab him in a big hug and calm him down, his head is covered in blood from nose to ears. But after cleaning him up I can't find any wounds. I realize he's mauled the intruder and must have ripped their legs up really well. I let him sleep with me in my bed that night with a baseball bat, just in case whoever it was came back with friends for round 2. My dog remained the goofball he always had been, but walked with a swagger after that night. He's very pleased with his bravery. Zips up, walks across the front of his truck, and just as he turns to open his door something massive whizzes by the front. We all gave a what was that, and the dog, who was trying to jump out of the right side of the truck was now yanking on the leash trying to jump out of the left side of the bed. We got out of there pretty quick. This is the first of two instances. First, I was alone in the basement, playing GTA 4 with my friend on my PC. It gets to about 1 a.m. and we're having a blast, shooting RPGs and throwing grenades willy-silly. Then I heard a sound that really doesn't fit with GTA. I figured it was not coming from my headset, so I took it off. The sound that's being made is coming from an old music box that we have. The last time it was used was probably 10 years ago. And this thing is just full on blaring its song. I start chanting "no, no, 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 no" and book it upstairs, leaving my friend on Skype pretty confused. My mom and dad are coming down from their room, my dad equipped with a baseball bat. As you can imagine, it was hard to explain to them that it was not an intruder. My second instance was in the same basement. Now, my basement has a main area where most of our furnishings are, and a satellite room off of that. Then, there's the unfinished part of the basement where I'm sure the spirits dwell, but I digress. I'll post pics of the basement if this gets popular. Anyway, this time I'm playing GTA 4 again with the same friend. It's about 1 a.m. again, and we decided to call it a night. I'm browsing Reddit while I cool down from video games with my headset off to let my ears take a break. It's at that point that I hear "da-da-da-da-da-ya" read with two little girl voices, from the bowels of the unfinished part of the basement. Now, it's pitch black around me except for my island of salvation at my computer. At this point, I'm just so done with ghosts that I say, fine, have the basement and go upstairs and go to bed. There are a couple more instances of spooky ghosts, but they're not as scary as these two. I'm a very practical and logical guy. When I first experienced sleep paralysis, I researched it and found that with it you may have odd/sometimes scary experiences, but that ultimately it was nothing to be afraid of. Pretty used to it now. Anyways, I live in Hudson Valley with my parents in an old wooden house built in 1712. Old, but comfortable. One night I fell asleep in the attic on the guest bed while watching Walking Dead. Around 6 a.m., I think, I had a dream. I forget the beginning, but I remember trying to escape the house for some unknown reason. Then I experienced a feeling of dread, probably from my sleep paralysis, and got the sense that a feminine ghost spirit/ghost/whatever wanted me to stay, badly. Nothing violent, but it was such an intense feeling. I felt stuck, and this is when I noticed my sleep paralysis. I focused on moving my pinky finger, which helps me snap out of it, and woke up. After a few seconds the door to the back of the attic, the creepy part of the attic LOL, jumped open. Now, the door has a latch that is fairly secure. You can push the door all you want, but as long as it's closed it won't open. Also, this has happened with the door before at random moments. I closed the door, got back into bed, turned on the lamp next to the nightstand. Within a few seconds the lamp blinked off and on. This could be for a number of reasons, but I've never noticed that happen before. I don't believe in ghosts, but it's been hard to come up with a logical explanation for this one, especially concerning the latch. I've fiddled with it a bunch and you have to lift it, otherwise it won't open. Still happens some nights.
I had been staying in my basement for the longest time and had gone through some eye-opening family crises recently, so I decided to finally break up with my loser ex, and it was pretty bad. Safe to say the cops were involved. At the same time my brother decided not to come home that same night, so I stayed upstairs and slept on the couch just in case he decided to come home. When I got up around 8 the next morning, I came downstairs and noticed my things were not where I'd left them, and my laptop was on. I of course got very nervous at this point and checked the history on my browser. The last page visited was to look for a bus from my house to my ex's that was due to leave in the next few minutes. I had a mini panic attack and searched my basement to find that there was a makeshift bed in the back room and the window was open. My ex had broken into my house and been sleeping in the back room, and I had just barely missed running into him. I used to work for a production company in Hollywood back in the 90s. It was a house that had been converted into an office. I would often stay after work and watch movies on the huge TV they had in the upstairs den. The people who owned the company were super rich, with full-time security staff and living in help, etc. Throughout the night, every night, a guard would come down to the office to make sure all was well, and when I was there I would hear them walking around, so I would go out and let them know I was there. Now, sometimes I would hear someone moving about, but when I went out, no one would be there. I always wrote it off thinking I had just missed them, or was hearing things from the TV, etc. Well, one night, after I'd been at the company for almost a year, I'm at work late, actually working. Where my desk was, just behind the reception desk, there was a half wall between me and the main floor. As I was sitting there working on my project, I suddenly got that feeling when you know someone is looking at you. I looked up, and over at the wall, peering around the wall, I saw a lady's face. She had long, flowing white hair, pale skin, wide crazy eyes, and her mouth was drawn back in a rictus, really pulled back from her teeth in an insane grin, almost. Even as I stared at her, as she was staring back at me, I knew I wasn't seeing her with my eyes, if that makes any sense. I was seeing her in my mind. I know that sounds nut, but it's the only way to explain what I was experiencing. Anyway, we stared at each other for about 10 seconds, and then I calmly turned back to my computer and went back to work. In my head, I was freaking out, but I didn't let her see that. Of course, I was convinced I was imagining things, but it was disturbing, nonetheless. After a minute or so, I turned back, and she was gone. I steadily, but swiftly shut down my system and booked it the hell out of there. About a week later, I was up at the owner's house, helping set up a party or something. They had this family from South America that they helped out, employing the parents and putting the kids through school. I had become friendly with them. So, I'm in the dining room with the husband, and I ask him if anything weird has ever happened down at the office. He looks at me and says, "You've seen her too?" He went on to tell me that there were some ladies who worked at the house who refused to go to the office. Just wouldn't go near the place. I never could find anything about what the place was like before they bought it or about the previous owners. Needless to say, my nights of TV watching were done, and not long after I left the company, although not because of her. Couple years later, I was watching Mario Bava's Black Sabbath for the first time. Almost the spitting image, and I swear I'd never seen it before that night. A few years ago, a former boss passed away. Me and my father went to the wake to pay our respects. I had to wait in line to see the body and say my goodbye. After I say goodbye, I try to find some former coworkers when I run into my boss walking around. I proceeded to fall staring at the guy who was dead 2 minutes ago, who is now walking around. Turns out he had a twin brother that no one ever told me about. Me and my 2 cousins, twin girls, were walking home from fishing in my neighborhood. I was 8 and there were 10. I grew up in South Florida where it rains frequently and oftentimes very hard. So, conveniently, it started pouring rain and we sprinted to my house. When we got to the house the door was locked and we began knocking to no response. My parents were having a party, so the fact that nobody responded was odd. This is where it gets weird. I don't know if anyone else here felt this as a child, but we all became inexplicably scared. To the point where the twins were crying. I don't know if it was just childish intuition or the peculiarity of no one answering the door, but our unanimous fear was very strange and unforgettable. As the pouring rain continued to come down, I knocked on the door again and screamed for my parents. As I did, we all heard a voice, "You can come over here." A small child's voice. The 3 of us all looked around for the speaker, but saw no one. This made matters worse. We all began frantically pounding on the door. We heard the voice again, "Come over here." We saw no one again. At this point we all lost it, and I joined the twins in the act of sobbing like a baby. We then heard the voice a 3rd time, "Don't be scared." I couldn't stand at the door for 1 second longer. I ran to the side of my house, and climbed over the fence, to find the entirety of my family sitting in our back patio, enjoying my parents' party. My dad ran up to me, and asked what was wrong, and I couldn't come up with how to explain what had just happened. Me and him went through the house, and opened the front door for the twins, who were still sobbing. The odd thing is we never really explained what had so spooked to anyone else there. We're 25 and 27 now, and very close still. We brought this story up last month after having a few beers. We still don't really know what went on that day, but we were all unanimous in remembering it as one of the scariest things that ever happened to us.
I'm a garbage man. Not the typical big city types who get to use the fancy garbage trucks that pick up and empty cans on their own. We still need to dump garbage cans by hand. One of our day's routes consists of rolling around the edge of our town, including rural pickups for households willing to pay the town to come into the rural municipality to get their stuff. We were getting one house, just a typical farmhouse type place. Lots of old vehicles around the house. Open the trash can, and, hooves. Just hooves. A ton of them. I think they were pig hooves, though the amount of brown hair on them leaves me to believe they may have potentially been goat hooves, though they were bigger than goats. Swine farming isn't that big where I live, which is why I'm not sure they were pigs, though we do have boar hunting around here. Anyways, if you're throwing away boar hooves, throw them in a bed, don't just toss them at the top of your bin. Makes me assume you live in a house of horrors. Not really a sight one prepares themselves to see. I was sitting in the back seat of our station wagon when I was startled by a banging on the window. A man told me to open the door. Being at the uncooperative stage of my childhood, I asked, "Why?" He said, "Your grandmother is very sick. I'm supposed to take you to the hospital." Several things ran through my mind. Both my grandmothers lived an hour's drive away. Relatives would have phoned first. And how did this guy find us in this parking lot 15 minutes drive away from home? I reached up and locked the door. It had been unlocked the whole time. The man tried to open the door. I reached into the front of the car and locked the front door. Then I did the far side of the car. He eventually got around to checking all the doors. And I sat there like a goldfish in a bowl while the cat tried to get at it. So, I was saved. When my wife and I were just dating as undergrad students in Montana, we'd sneak into the local Best Western to use the pool. Usually it'd be deserted, but this one time, the last time we did this, a family with 3 kids showed up, along with a family friend. Whatever, we weren't making out or anything, just chilling out in the hot tub and pool. After a while this guy showed up, asked if we minded if he hopped in the hot tub, and of course we were in no position to tell him yes, we mind. Anyway, prior to getting in, and prior to getting undressed, he kneels at the side of the jacuzzi and dunks his head in. For like, more than 30 seconds. Then pulls his head out, shakes his head, splashing us in the process, and repeats this about 3 or 4 times. The best part is, it's a rectangular jacuzzi, and we're all the way at one end, and he's like doing this right next to us instead of at the other end. Then he gets in, submerges his entire body, horizontally, and proceeds to hold his breath for like 30 to 40 seconds. While he's doing this, he's stretching his legs out towards us, and we finally decide to get out when he starts brushing us with his feet. We hop in the pool with the 3 kids. He chills in the jacuzzi for like another 10 minutes, gets out, wraps up in a towel, and crouches by the steps to the pool, near the shallow end where the kids are playing. He is crouching but in the fetal position with his arms wrapped around his legs, and staring at the kids, begins rocking back and forth while an intense look shows up and the intense look intensifies. After about 5 minutes of this he realizes everyone is staring at him because he's being a weirdo, and he leaves just as the mother calls hotel security. As we're hoping it right out of there and trying to leave the hotel, my wife is getting changed in the ladies' room when I look out the window and see him in his car in the parking lot. Waiting. Staring right at me. So, I called the police, explained the situation, did not admit to sneaking into the pool though, and we waited until he drove off.
When I was 6 to 7, I lived with my dad, who was a kind of dubious fellow, with lots of dubious friends. His main fix was coke, but he also indulged in identity theft, impersonating police officers, and lewd and lascivious behavior. My mom was a hard-working liquor store employee with dreams of living in the country and owning a small house where we could come and stay with her. They split back when I was a toddler after 6 years of my mom getting smacked around and nearly drowned in the bathtub a few times. Real great guy, my dad. My dad had a lot of drug friends live with him on and off. One was named Mike. Mike was always a nice guy to my older sister and I, a bit quiet and dead-eyed, but he had a Great Dane, and to a 7-year-old kid that meant he had to be a good guy. Whenever he would come around, he would ask us about our mom, where she worked, where she lived, what kind of house she lived in, about the neighbors. We would laugh and tease him that he had a crush on her, the dastardliest thing a kid could assume about a guy interested in their single mom. My mom didn't tell me this until about a month ago. I am now 24, but apparently she got a phone call from a friend of hers who was a police officer that apparently this guy living with my dad had done time for manslaughter and armed robbery. The officer called my mom anonymously from a payphone to let her know that she should immediately take us and go on vacation. Confused and scared, my mom, not much older at the time than I am now, took my sister and I and went out of town for the week. When she returned, she found out Mike had broken into her apartment building and later been picked up on unrelated charges. There was evidence on him that he had been paid by my father to beat and my mother as revenge for leaving him. And that's why I tell people I don't have a dad when they ask casually about my parents. Probably the creepiest thing to happen to me was when I stayed the night at a friend's place. We slept together in her twin-size bed since I don't like sleeping outside of a bedroom and her house is known to have supernatural occurrences. Well, we had been asleep for a while, and I woke up at around 6 in the morning and had to answer the call of nature. While I was in the bathroom, I looked down at my thigh and I noticed something rather odd. There was a red handprint on my thigh. It was also facing as if someone were behind me and had their hand on my thigh, so fingers pointed to the feet. I pressed my hand to it to see if maybe I fell asleep on my hand and it left a mark, but my hand was way smaller than the mark, and my friend has smaller hands than I, so it couldn't have been her. I'm a light sleeper, so no one could have come into the bedroom without me knowing, and especially no one could have touched me. She took a picture, and we didn't go back to sleep. Still have no idea what caused it. There was also the time I went to stay the night with my older sister at her place because she was getting paranoid. She said for the past few nights at around 12 in the morning there would be a smell that was kind of like brandy. I hadn't smelled it before, so I just trusted her on that. We were talking in her bed, and we paused because the smell started to come. It was faint and steadily got stronger, but never overwhelmingly so. As we were talking about it, we heard a crash in the living room. I cautiously opened up the bedroom door to see all 3 of the cats with their fur bristling and on full alert mode. We checked the house all over the next day, and nothing was out of place, and we never found out what caused the smell.
When I was 17, I had some friends who worked at the KZOK Haunted House in Des Moines, Washington in October. A group put on the haunted house called Scare Productions, and they would bring in local high school students and others to work the haunted house. I'd done it the year before and knew what we were supposed to do for different things. How to get in and out when the house was on, how to interact with patrons, what we could and could not do, no touching, knowing when to stop, etc., how to call for help, other things. Before we would open every night, there was a setup meeting and a wrap meeting. Some of the sets were really good and you'd get the chance to pop out at people, but the worst was a barbershop. It was a boo as you had a gut pretend to be a psychotic barber and another person worked as the victim. The night that I'm remembering, I pulled victim duty. I got set up with a great guy, can't remember his name, but he knew that set and as a shorter guy he could get around it. I'm nearly 6 foot and I was 190 pounds in college from working out and playing sports. We figured out what the plan was, how to do some good scares, and left it at that. Night goes fine for the most part, get some people running through, and a few that just don't care. As it's getting later, a group of 4 comes through, 2 couples, mid to late 30s, African American, and drunk as all hell. They are laughing and yelling, and you can smell the booze from around the corner. They look in and laugh as the barber charges up to the railing and scares the ladies. The guys started laughing, and one reached over the rail to grab my leg. Another of the big rules, don't touch the actors, or our rule is that we can touch you. I was lying dead as a nail, he says, "Hey bro, you alright?" I whip out of the chair and charge him saying, "Wanna die," in the darkest voice I could pull. He rushes back and hits the wall. The guy with me leaps up and grabs his shirt, swinging his plastic knife at him, and this guy panics. He just freaks out suddenly and tries to run around the corner. Well, right around the corner is our cage scare, where a chain link area is set up and this great girl is working at night in a white dress and chains. She charges in and hits the cage, grabbing for him. Next, there are spiders that drop down on people normally run by younger kids who get a kick out of it. The guy, still panicking, starts swinging at the air and runs back towards us around the hall. The guy with me is already over the rail and tells him to come back here. The drunk's eyes roll up in his head and he passes out and crashes through this side door that can't be seen, and his head goes through a wooden shelf there. The other actor and I were laughing, and he stops and follows up with, "Holy shit, I think we killed him." We tried asking if he was okay, no response, so I ran over and started jamming the panic button. We have to alert security that there is a problem. Time rolls by and security comes through. They check the guy and stay with him until paramedics arrive, and we are told to stay in our seats. After some time, they get him into a wheelchair and take some statements, and we think that's it. The next night everyone gets together before we go out to get the pep talk for the night, and we get a breakdown from the woman who runs things. She reminds us of the rules and that we need to remember the panic buttons, explains the incident to everyone there, and then adds what we didn't see. After the guy was taken out by paramedics, he started to sober up and saw that there were 2 cops there. He whips out of the ambulance and starts swinging at the cops, yelling, "I am not going to no jail, you gonna have to kill me." They don't know what's up and try telling them things are fine. He keeps freaking out. Eventually, the pepper sprays the fear out of him. He was a big guy, and it took a lot to put him down, so much that the cops drove him 30 feet to leave and needed to let their cruiser air out. It just so happened that he'd kidnapped a little girl 2 days earlier, and that's why he was freaking out.
My best mate and I managed a tiny, live-in, pub around Piccadilly Circus area in London right after we finished university. It was coincidentally also pretty close to the Houses of Parliament. Many Saturdays before we close, at pub times 11 p.m. in the UK, the proprietor from a place somewhere in our street would come and ask if he can borrow some liquor for the party he is hosting, and then he'll bring it back the next Monday. He would always bring back the few cases of vodka/tequila or whatever he borrowed with an extra bottle as a thank you, so we would never say no. He only introduced himself to us as Dragon, had a thick Eastern European accent, and we could never find this mythical venue no matter how hard we looked. When he one Saturday mentioned his huge absinthe collection along with an invitation to come and try it, we simply couldn't say no, us being poor students and curious to death after all. It turned out that 2 doors down from us there was a basement with nothing but a list of first names on the door. We found out that it was a super discreet club, that specialized in whatever you want, S&M and fetishes. On Saturday nights they had a lesbian swinging party, for lack of a better name, with the weirdest collection of people, that only got in on an invitation basis. This was not a fantasy type of lesbian event but the real thing. We are talking beards and muscles included. The 2 of us, very straight conservative boys, shuffled to the bar and familiarized ourselves with absinthe. Later realizing that almost half the people were naked and the rest halfway there, it was very erotic and very weird. What made it even more so was that all this was going on around us, and we were visibly outsiders who had no interest in being there, apart from the free booze, and no one was interested in us, so it was as if we were not there at all. We were pretty freaked out, and drunk, when we left, but we actually went back a few more times for the free drinks whenever Mr. Dragon invited us. Today I still walk down that street on occasion, but I always grin when I see the basement entrance with that list on the door and wonder who else knows what really happens there. About 6 months ago my 4-year-old started having trouble sleeping and waking up at night scared, and eventually told us that he was seeing these 2 kids who wanted to play with him in his room. There were a series of incidents around that time that were totally unnerving and would have been my story, except we thought it was all past us, and then one night a few weeks ago he was screaming for me, so I went to sleep next to him and calmed him down. Lying there in the near dark, I noticed the sliding closet door was partly open, which was odd because we always make sure the closet's closed when we put him to bed. I'm tired, it's around 3 a.m., I really don't want to get up and close the closet door, but it's bothering me and I'm getting a really strange feeling like I definitely should close that closet door, and the closet itself is pitch black, and did we leave it open this one time? So finally, after about 10 minutes of internal debate, I sit up on the side of the bed, get up and walk over to the closet door to close it. But by the time I reach it, it's already closed. It didn't make a sound. I didn't see it move. But it was open when I was in bed and shut when I got up to close it. In the 1980s and early 90s, the street where my family and I live in England was a street full of student houses/squats. It was a terrace of old Victorian houses that had slowly deteriorated and become pretty worthless. My parents bought the house at the same time as a few other families started buying these ridiculously cheap, big houses. This was pre my arrival and they then did the house up. Jump forward 10 years and I am sharing a room with my younger brother. It is around 11:30 p.m. and we are asleep along with my mum in the room next to us. My dad is still awake downstairs and hears some people in the back garden. He looks out of the sash windows in the living room to see 3 men creeping up the garden wearing all black with balaclavas. He proceeds to ring the police, who tell him to check out the front to see what's on the roadside of the house. He says at this point he was absolutely bricks but checked anyway. To check he would have to open the front door. When he looked out onto the road there was a car driving slowly past and all he saw was the man in the passenger seat wearing a Margaret Thatcher mask waving slowly. Creepy. The police turned up in full riot gear shortly after and checked all the bottom floor of my house and outside but didn't find anything. He didn't tell me, my brother, or my mum until I was 20 years old and said that was the first time he had told anyone. I was working in a German-Italian restaurant for some time. It was located in the Black Forest in a very picture and well-known town. Summertime and we're crazy busy. I mean, we were so busy people had to wait sometimes an hour for their food. The stress level was at an all-time high. During that time, we got a new chef. The boss and owner told us he speaks only Italian, and we didn't really think anything about it. Whenever food was late we would fight, not physically, with the chefs. It was us who had to go back to the tables to tell the people their food wasn't ready yet. Anyways, the next day and the new chef didn't arrive. It was early still, so we didn't think anything about it. He doesn't turn up all day and now we are in real trouble. There were only 2 other chefs in the kitchen. Next day I am sitting in front of the restaurant, which is on a little hill overlooking the main part of the town with lake, and I see the new chef walking in a brisk type of way, and I am shouting out to my boss, "EY. There's the new guy." At the same time, I see the guy getting taken down by armed police SWAT style, very unusual in Germany. I mean, there were cops everywhere. He is arrested and taken away. We cannot believe our eyes. Turns out, the guy escaped a mental hospital for the criminal insane back in Italy. He makes it all the way to our town because he wants to kill his estranged wife and kids. The night before he was arrested he gets his whole family to an old train station and butchers them, and I mean Hannibal Lecter Blood Eagle style, all of them, the wife and 2 kids. He worked in the kitchen, and I had to bring back the penne arrabbiata he cooked cold. It was about 10 a.m. and I was asleep and hot, awoken by someone head banging on the door, despite us having a doorbell. I decided it must have been an idiot or a door-to-door salesman, and in either case I couldn't be bothered to get out of bed and answer the door. Fast forward 10 minutes and I'm now awake and spending my morning in the downstairs toilet. I hear loud noises in the garden, on the decking. But then I started hearing voices, and this is the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my life, and I haven't even realized it yet. I hear the noises and voices again, and suddenly there's a guy sticking his head through the toilet window. I had no idea what to do. He locked his eyes with mine and I'm just sitting there. He tried to get in, but he was stuck in the window because it was too small a gap for anyone to fit through. I grabbed the bleach next to me and squirted it in his face. He withdrew, and his buddy helped him over the fence, and I guess they ran. I finished up and called the police. They ended up catching them at the hospital. A few years ago, I received an invitation to what would be the American equivalent of a sci school reunion. I wasn't exactly Mr. Popular during that period, so I was hesitant to go, but my wife convinced me that it would be fun to see some familiar faces. Anyway, I go there, and it goes exactly the way I expected. I recognize a few people but don't know any well enough to start a conversation, plus people are already in groups talking to each other, so I do what I do best, sit in a corner and start drinking. After a while this girl comes sitting next to me. She seems like she's having as much of a good time as I am. I don't really recognize her, but we're having some small talk and I'm finally a bit less bored. As we speak, I start noticing something strange about the way she's behaving, but I can't really tell what it is. I remember thinking at some point that she might be flirting with me, but can't really figure it out. Anyway, we continue to talk, and the more we do, the more I realize there's not something weird with that girl. There's something wrong. She's forgetting some words or mispronouncing them, she's not being coherent, but I just go along. Again, I don't remember that girl at all from school, so I'm thinking maybe she's handicapped, maybe she has a speech disorder, or maybe she had some kind of accident, but clearly I won't be that who asks her if she's alright or if there's anything wrong. Then suddenly in the middle of a sentence she freezes completely. I see it in my head in slow motion as if it happened yesterday. Her eyes go blank and the sip from the drink she just had is drooling from her mouth. The look on her face is the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. It might sound cheesy, but it was like looking at death right in the eyes. Then her head fell to the side. I couldn't move. I was so shocked I couldn't scream for help. I was frozen. I finally managed to call for help since no one had noticed what happened. I must have scared quite a few people because everyone came running to our table. I couldn't speak, but people quickly realized what the problem was. They started CPR and called an ambulance, but I knew that this girl was dead. The ambulance arrived and the EMT tried to continue CPR, but I could tell they knew there was nothing more they could do. They left and I never heard anything back. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe I've seen too many movies, but I was thinking the doctors, the police, or the family would have contacted me to find out what happened, what her last words were, but they never did. A few days later I saw in the local newspaper that she had died. I thought about going to the funeral but couldn't gather the courage. To this day the look in her eyes terrifies me.
In 1999, on my drive south on I-57 in southern Illinois, a man in a white older model pickup truck pulled alongside me and pointed furiously to my rear tire. I was a 19-year-old female, without a cell phone, and so I just waved him off and let him pass me, thinking he was just a weirdo. Instead of driving away, he slowed down to about 55 miles per hour, and I decided to pass him. He sped up and kept motioning to the rear tire/back of my car, and he wouldn't let me pass. For 20+ miles this game of speeding up and slowing down, holding up traffic, driving next to me, blocking me, he kept it up. As the sun was setting, I knew I had to do something. I got in the right lane, let him get in the left lane, and I ducked behind a semi and wouldn't let him in front of me. He had to pass me, so I slowed down, put on my hazards, and got off at the next exit ramp, turned back onto North I-57 and went north until I found a gas station and called my parents from a payphone. There was absolutely nothing wrong with my car, and I'm still convinced to this day that had I pulled off of the interstate to see what he wanted, that I would have been murdered. The weirdest experience of my life.
I was a cat person for a long time. One of my cats was a Burmese named Judy, and she loved to jump up on the bed with a little meowed grunt when we were sleeping. One night after she hadn't done it for a long time, she'd been pretty weak and sick, I felt and heard her jump up and snuggle up against me. The bed dipped under her weight and everything. I reached back to scritch behind her ears, but couldn't reach her. Then I remembered she had died 2 days before.
In 2005, a girlfriend and I'm a girl, attended a really expensive wedding in downtown KC. We left at 2 a.m. in my car. I wasn't seeing a lot of cars on the road until I came upon a car that seemed to be stalled in the middle of the road, maybe 15 feet from an intersection. The car didn't have its hazards on or anything, so I wasn't really sure what was going on, so I just stopped behind it and waited for it to move. We sat there maybe 10 seconds before I saw an arm come out of the driver's side window and motion for us to go around. I did so slowly and pulled up to the red light. I look in the rear view to see what's going on with that car, and to my surprise, it's now moving. I continue to watch it and notice it's not slowing down. He then proceeds to hit my car. I sat there kind of stunned. Did he really just hit me? What do I do now? Deciding I definitely don't want to die, I stay put in my car, waiting to see what he's going to do. Maybe 30 seconds pass, and when I don't get out, he backs up and speeds around me. Much to my friend's dismay, I am not letting him get away. I at least needed a license plate number, so I chased him down and got it. The next day I went to the police station to report it, and they didn't care. Don't even want to take the report. To this day, I wonder if he was some kind of rapist. What if I could have cracked a case? Bastard police. I was house sitting for a friend. The homes in his neighborhood are layered too deep from the street, so the backyard of his home is open to a few other houses. The very first night I locked up and went to sleep on the couch. It was a very windy night, so there was a great deal of audible noises from outside. At some point in the night, the living room was filled with wind. It woke me up. At first, I felt like I was dreaming, as wind whipped around the living room. Then a woman walked right past me as I lay on the couch. She was wearing a white gown. I about leapt to my feet. Hello? I asked. She slowly turned and scanned the room with the blankiest expression. It's like she didn't even see me right in front of her. She slowly left the living room and walked into the adjacent den, and I followed. She had opened a sliding glass door I clearly recalled locking. The wind was whipping in through the open door, which is what woke me. She walked out, slid the door closed, locked it with a key she retrieved from her pocket, and made her way to the house behind his. I watched her walk inside, close her front door, and a moment later turn off the lights. The next morning, I called my friend. Turns out they used to watch each other's homes when away, vacation, business, etc. The medication she used caused her to sleepwalk. She must have sleepwalked over, let herself in, and went through the motions of checking his house in her sleep, something she used to do awake for him. That afternoon I went to her house and discussed what happened. Her name was Kat. She was mortified and apologized profusely, though we ended up having a good laugh about it. 2 nights later, she did the same thing. When I woke up and saw her wandering the house, I just said, "Hello, Kat." "Hi," she replied, and proceeded to sit down in the lazy boy chair and go to sleep. In the morning I woke her up, and she was confused. We both agreed that it was time to discuss the medication with her doctor. I found a wallet with a $50 bill in it. I refused myself and didn't take the money. Instead, I called one of the numbers inside, in which the wallet's owner answered. He met me back at the park where I had found the wallet. He then gave me his thanks and went on his merry way. So, I walked back to my vehicle with my newfound prospects of a karma reward sometime in the near future. I realize quickly that my doors are locked and go for the trunk. Open. So, I rolled my back seat forward to crawl through, and there it was. Amongst the dirt, ancient grime, and spilled motor oil from years past. I kid you not. One crisp $50 bill. I was happy, but a little creeped out. I was walking back through my hometown a couple of months ago after a long night out. As I was going through the square, I saw a girl leave a bar. There were these 2 guys behind her. They didn't look like they had been out partying, and I still don't know what it was about them, but I didn't like the way they followed her. I ended up following them for a while, and they eventually swung off. My town has a bad history, and I may just have been paranoid, but I'm glad I wasted those extra 30 minutes. My uncle's brother, SO's side of the family, died when he was about 16, I believe. He drowned in one of the lakes here. It seems like a lot of people have drowned in that lake and our whole family avoids that place. Anywho, my uncle found an envelope at the top of the stairs in his house one day. It was just a plain white envelope. It wasn't marked in any way, and he had no idea how it got there. He opened it and it had several pictures of his brother in his casket. No one, absolutely no one, had taken pictures at the funeral. They don't even have pictures of the grave that I know of. It's a really, really tender subject with the family and they do not like to talk about it. Nobody had been in his house, and nobody knew where the hell the envelope or the pictures came from. I think he still has them. I'd have to ask my husband. It freaked my uncle right the hell out. He was pretty frantic about it. My uncle has a son and names him Ben after the same brother that drowned. He recently turned 6. I used to babysit Ben on a regular basis. One day, Ben was talking about how his birthday was the next day. I couldn't remember if that was right or not, so I asked Mom. She went pale. No, the next day was not little Ben's birthday. The next day would have been deceased Ben's birthday. Like I said, deceased Ben is a really tender subject. The family doesn't really talk about it, and there's no way little Ben could have known about that. Little Ben was also talking about how he once had a Rubio cube. We all knew little Ben had never had one of those. Deceased Ben did. One day my uncle was making little Ben a PB&J. Little Ben asked him if he still liked PB&J, because I remember you liked them when we were brothers. There have been other instances like this with little Ben. It really creeps me out.
Mid-90s, Midwest town. My parents' house sits on a fairly large lake. You could see the other side, but you wouldn't want to try to swim across. Now at this time, we didn't have high-speed internet and infinite show to watch. We didn't even have cable out in the boonies, so we had to find more creative ways to entertain ourselves. So, we stole, my mother's minivan and set out in an attempt to locate the creepy rundown dock on the other side of the lake from our house. We left at midnight. 2 hours later and we're not having any luck. Our direction sense isn't the best and the lake is big enough that there is no clear route to this place. Just as we were about to give up, we saw it. A little almost gravel road, I believe the term is chipped and sealed, that leads back towards the lake from the main road. About a mile down the road there is a sign that reads Egypt Hollow, no visitors. Yeah, right. The first house we passed should have been enough for us to turn around. The house is ancient, there are 3 gravestones in the front yard and a single lit candle in the middle upstairs window. So that's a little strange. Whatever. We keep going. 2 houses go by uneventfully, but the third one has an odd sight to see at 2:30 a.m. An ancient couple on rocking chairs happily rocking back and forth. Back and forth. They have an old-school lantern sitting on one of those barrels that Donkey Kong likes to throw. The weird thing was, they didn't even look up as we drove past, just stared straight ahead rocking back and forth, back and forth. Our resolve is becoming shaky, but we continue. Another mile down the road and success. We found the spooky dock across the lake from our house, and it did not disappoint in the spooky department. It's run down, severely, and sitting by what remains of the picnic area is the corpse of a deer, or what was left of it. Only half of the deer is there, the other half was eaten or ripped in half or God knows what. As we are sitting there speculating, we hear this horrendous noise, like starting an engine with no oil in it. It was so loud, I'll never forget it. We floored it and our wheels spun in the gravel. That 2 seconds of our wheels spinning was probably the scariest single moment of my life. I thought we were stuck. It's amazing how many instantaneous terrible thoughts you can have in such a short amount of time. Wheels finally catch and off we go. A few minutes of what later, we are headed back towards the main road to get the hell out of there. We're about halfway back to the main road and there is this eerie orange light coming from the woods to our right. I want to leave. We turn down this super narrow road that is more like a hiking trail and head toward the light. We round the next corner and there is an open field with a massive bonfire, like Wicker Man style. And standing around this fire is about 20 to 30 people with their arms in the air like some sort of weird ritual. One of them points at us and in unison, they all turn to look. If you ever need to know the performance limits of a 1988 Plymouth Voyager on a dirt road in reverse, I'm your man. We noped harder than anyone has ever noped before. And so ended our adventure to Egypt Hollow. That was 20 years ago now, and although we still talk about it from time to time, we never went back. Back in the day, 81 or 82, when I was an international truck driver, I moved out to Oklahoma for business reasons. This house was the only one around for about 2 or 3 miles in any direction and about 15 minutes from the closest town. I'm talking so secluded that you could hear a person tiptoeing from 10 feet away if you listened for it. Anyways, on the very first day there, me and my newlywed wife unpacked our stuff and got situated in the 2-floor house. After a long day, we decided to take a break and have a little nap and finish up the little bit of work we had later. This was right before sunset when we got in bed, and I instantly fell asleep. I woke up after what felt like hours to see a young blonde girl, probably 16 to 19 years old, wearing only white, standing right over me looking down with a peaceful smile. I could feel my wife laying against me breathing heavily, so I knew she was still asleep. I just looked up at her in astonishment and fear. I could have only been awake for this for about 7 or 8 seconds before I fell back to sleep. I woke up to the sun beating down on my face from the window and looked at my watch to find that we had been asleep for around 14 hours. I asked my wife if she recalled anything strange, but didn't go into detail so as not to frighten her. The strangest things are A, that I know I couldn't have been dreaming because I was wide awake and aware of everything that was happening and fully recall all of the details, and B, if she was real she had to have walked a pretty good distance as I would have heard a car coming, and she had to have been incredibly silent while in the house. The few years that I was there I tried my hardest to find out about the history of the house and if anyone knew of such a girl around there. I never found an explanation for it all and I never saw her again. The only thing I learned was that the previous owner hanged himself in the barn, but I feel like that has nothing to do with my experience. My roommate and I moved into this really old house that was under renovation. We had a deal saying we would live for free if we did all the work. That was really fun. It was a big 5-bedroom house and barn out in the middle of nowhere, Texas. We worked and lived at that place for almost 2 years. Around Christmas time in the first year, we started to get letters from someone we didn't know. It had our address on it. We knew it wasn't a mistake, because we were the only house on that road for over 2 miles in both directions. So, we sent them back to the sender every time. About the 7th letter we decided to look up the address and do some investigating. It turned out it was from a prison. We got kinda freaked out because no one had lived at that house for 3 years before we moved in. We decided to open the letter to find out if we could get it to the right person or what have you. The letter read something like he missed his kids and wanted them to come visit and wants to see his wife and she needs to write back. So, we wrote him back saying they don't live here anymore, and we were sorry we don't have an address for them. Some time went past and we got another letter from him not addressed to anyone. We opened it thinking it might shed light on our pen pal. It said about the same thing. We kept getting letters with no name on them saying stuff like that, but we never wrote back. We told our landlord about it, and he said the people left and he got the house in an auction. He had no clue about the people that owned it before. After God knows how many letters. We got one that said he would be getting out in a few months and not to be surprised if he showed up. We started to freak out. So, we wrote back and said the people you know don't live here and if you show up we would call the police. After we sent that he sent a letter saying I can't wait to see you, I will be home in April. We went to the police. They said the man was in jail for domestic violence and assault with a deadly weapon. Awesome. We were told that they would talk to his PER and track him, but if he showed up call the police. April came and passed and so did May and June. We stopped thinking he was going to show up. On August 1st a car pulled off the road and stopped at the end of the driveway for about 20 or so men. The people, 3 men, got out and started to walk across the yard. I opened the door and had my roommate with a shotgun and his phone waiting around the corner. I asked if I could help them and one of the men said he used to live here and wanted to look around. At that time, I told my roommate to call the cops and give me the gun. Standing in the doorway with the gun behind the door I told them firmly that had no business here and needed to leave. They kept walking towards me not saying anything. I produced the shotgun and aimed it at them and told them to go away. They ran to the car and drove off. The cops showed up 30 minutes later. I gave them the plate and make of the car and told them what happened. A few days later we found out they got picked up and he was back in jail for meth and having a firearm. We moved 2 months later. One day I was home alone. The phone rang and I picked it up. I said hello and all I heard on the other line was, "You're just going to stand there? Why aren't you running?" This was followed by a very creepy laugh. This is where it escalated. I hear the laugh and happen to look out my window. At the edge of my driveway close to the road, a white creeper van is parked motionless. When the person on the other line hangs up, I am immediately scared. My thought, someone is watching me from this creepy van. Now, I am easily scared, but I can put on a good show sometimes. So, to show that I'm not scared, I grabbed my rifle from my room, unloaded, as well as a baseball bat. Holding each over my shoulder, I walked out to the beginning of my driveway and stared at the van. It slowly drove away, and I called my parents asking them to come home. They did not. I called my brother and explained the situation, but he didn't come either. So yeah, I was pretty scared for the next few hours. My guess is that someone called my house and used a recording to prank us, and the van was unrelated and simply coincidental. At least I hope. Back when I was in junior high, my mom had an attractive 21-year-old Polish woman living with us in exchange for house upkeep. One weekend night, the woman staying with us came in from hanging out with friends and went into the basement where her bedroom was. When she found the underlying cause of the stairs and turned the light on, a man dressed in black started walking toward her. She screamed and ran up the stairs. The man walked up the stairs and out of the house through the door at the top of the stairs. I'll never forget my brother, only 13 years old at the time, coming into my room saying he heard a scream. I hadn't heard it and told him he'd be hearing things. I woke up a half hour later to the police searching our house. They got prints off the doorknob, but couldn't find a match until they caught a man who would later be called the Birmingham Rapist, a man convicted of raping several women in the area we lived in. My mom told the police she distinctly remembers having locked all the doors before going to bed. Apparently, this man had stalked the woman staying with us and watched our family's daily behaviors. He'd entered our home early in the morning while we were in the yard and sat in the basement in our utility room until she got home. The thought of us going about our day, while a man sat in our house waiting for the right time to hurt the woman staying with us creeps me out to this day. There was a period of my life where I was struggling with some pretty heavy depression and, while not outright suicidal, I kept thinking that living a short life would be ideal because I didn't want to endure the issues I was dealing with for decades. One day in particular these thoughts were heavy on my mind. I remember very clearly thinking about the fact that a lot of religious people consider a long life to be a gift from God, but I would consider it a curse. Later I had to go to school and so got on a bus and took a seat by the window. It was a pretty empty bus, so no one had to sit next to anyone else if they didn't want to. Then this old guy got on. Annoyingly, he decided to sit next to me. Whatever. Annoying, but not a big deal. A few seconds passed and then he started speaking to me. I took off my headphones and said, "Excuse me." He replied with, "You are going to live for a very long time." Startled, but also amused, I smiled and said, "How do you know?" His response was, "Satan told me today. And Satan knows everything." I didn't know what to say, so I just put my headphones back on. I am not sure if anyone else on the bus heard him, but no one seemed to have a visible reaction to this exchange. He then got off at the very next stop. This incident has boggled my mind for a very long time, to say the least. When I was about 17, I was at my friend's apartment building, which his parents owned. We had an apartment to hang out in on the top floor and used to go to the roof to smoke. One night, we were about to go up, but I had to pee, so I told him I'd meet him up there. After I was done, I went up the stairs to the attic portion that was connected to the roof. There were no lights, so we used our phones to guide us. It was an old building, and the attic was creepy and cluttered all the time. I was heading over the door that led out to the roof when I saw a shadow-like figure pass by me. I followed the direction it went, thinking it was my friend. I kept saying that I knew it was him and to stop playing around. It passed me a few more times, in different areas, moving in different direction. Then I heard my friend's voice from downstairs. He got a call from his girlfriend and was in another room talking to her the whole time. I have no idea what that shadow figure was, and I still refuse to go back up to the roof when it's dark after that night. Grandma was so excited that my wife and I were having our first child. It would be her first great-grandchild. She was so eager she started bringing random baby stuff each time she visited, including a mobile which she thought was adorable. It was a manual wind-up Winning the Pooh one that played music as it turned. Grandma died of a massive heart attack before our daughter was born. We had her crib in our bedroom, which was in a room with no windows, no cross-wind, nothing. There was a little light by the crib so my wife could peek on the baby every so often. A couple nights in, my wife and I bolted awake feeling a strange presence. We turned to the crib, baby still asleep thank goodness, and literally saw the crank for the mobile wind and the mobile started to go around, by itself. We were too in shock to scream. Guess Grandma got to see her after all. I get the shivers to this day. A friend and I went backpacking in Montana and were camped at a very young glacial lake, with very clear water, and really weird geologic formations. And bugs, there was a constant droning humming sound from the flies and mosquitoes. It was August during the shower, so we prepped up by taking a joint and then laying our sleeping bags up against a big log near our tent to watch the show. Which was awesome for quite a while when suddenly my friend says, "What was that?" "What?" I am tucked down in my bag and watching the sky. That bright flash of light over there on the ridge. I didn't see it. There. It happened again, that really bright flash of light in the woods. Where? Where? I say again. He is suddenly fast asleep, breathing deep and regular, and I get the most overpowering feeling that there is something there. Right behind the log. Right behind us. And I became paralyzed with the most overwhelming sense of fear and dread I had ever known. I keep trying to wake up my buddy, repeating his name, but I feel certain that if I move, terrible things will happen. This terror seizes me for what feels like 15 minutes or so, until I finally will myself to city up. And flip around to look behind us. Nothing but the dark. I wake my buddy up to tell him to move into the tents, and I check my watch. 4 hours had passed. My friend claims never to have seen a bright light that night. He says we watched the meteor shower, chatting the whole time, until we went to bed. When I was quite young, I had broken but vivid memories of getting lost in the woods with my dad and my sister. Despite the fact that both my sister and I remember the beginning and end of the day, neither of us remember the afternoon after a very specific point, and despite the fact that he clearly knows what we're talking about, my dad refuses to acknowledge most of the events of the day, how he knows which day we're talking about from made-up events, or what happened during the gaps in our memory. Morning, my dad, I'm 100% sure it was him, my sister and I walking along a path in a forest, I still have no idea where. In retrospect we were lost at this point, but at the time I didn't realize. We approached a car, in the middle of the forest, again in retrospect this was strange, but at the time fine. My dad approaches the car. For reasons our memories disagree on, my sister and I silently veer off into the forest. We must have got separated because we both remember being alone for a long time. We both remember finding a number of black plastic bags hanging from the trees and moving to open them, but neither of us remembers what was inside. I fixate on one bag in particular, but I don't remember why, and I'm suddenly aware of how alone I am. Evening, my next memory is walking behind my dad in the forest, watching him limp along in front of me. It had gotten dark. I remember waiting for him to fall down. I remember being in pain myself, but not wanting to complain since my dad wasn't. I have a vivid memory of my dad climbing into a river to lift my sister and I across. In retrospect, this implied extreme circumstances. At the time I knew what they were, but no matter how hard I try, I can't remember now. I asked him why we couldn't go back, and he told me to shut up, probably the first time my dad had said anything like that to me, because I was so shocked. Eventually we found a house that seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. But rather than go in and use their phone, as per my genius, or so it seemed at the time, suggestion, we did a few laps of the large grounds. Finally, my dad climbed over a fence, instead of using the open gate, and left my sister and I alone. My last memory is of him, half over the fence, on stage whispering directions to me, then telling me not to move. I pointed out that these were conflicting instructions, but that's stupid, and was scolded by my sister. That's the last thing I remember. I remembered these events at random, slowly over one day when I was about 18. I asked my dad about them, as he was just in the next room, and got mixed responses. I have a few stories. As a parent, I can tell you that trusting your parental instinct is huge. Even if you don't think you have an instinct. My wife's grandfather died, and at his funeral we were there with our then 4-month-old kiddo, calmly hanging out in his portable car seat. I was carrying him around when I began to feel a weird presence, like someone was watching my kid. This happened the entire funeral, the procession, very Catholic funeral, and the reception. I figured out that it was the same bearded older man that was following us. I had no reason to think he was an issue, but I kept my baby far from him and he kept trying to do the cute, what a nice baby routine with my kid. Offered to watch him for us. Shudder. I kept an eye on him and realized he was going from kid to kid and trying to touch them. Hugs, hand-hold, kisses, etc. Told my wife, who said she didn't know him, but we agreed to avoid him. Told my mom-in-law about it and she said he was her uncle. And that he used to babysit her and tried to molest her frequently. Her idiot parents never did anything. Basically, trust instinct. He was trolling and would have done something. Freak. Second story, I once worked at a youth summer camp in Ohio as a counselor for kids. I arrived early with my best friend to help set up the facilities before the rest of the staff. My friend was in an intense relationship and would often spend hours on the phone with his GF and fall asleep on the couch in the big house of the camp. Now the camp is huge, over about 20 acres, and we had been assigned to sleep in what was called the cage, which was a really old weird wooden cabin. There was literally no one else at the camp at that point, just the two of us. So, I would fall asleep in the cage while my friend was on the phone. Now I'm not the kind of guy that gets easily freaked out, only because I usually don't realize the severity of the situation until much later. I woke up out of a dead sleep to the sound of children laughing. In the dark. The EFF. So naturally, what do? I casually get up, go get my friend, long walk through an unlit field. Getting chills again as I write this. Blah, he had fallen asleep in the main building again. He is half awake and asks me who is laughing. The next day the rest of the staff arrives, and what do? They start telling ghost stories about the camp and the old director, from 100 years ago or something, and how at night you can still hear his campers, that he murdered of course, laughing at you. We started to tell the staff about the previous night and what happened, and they freaked out so bad they had to stop. Freaky time. Sorry for the text wall. Cheers. When I was about 5, my dad was a taxi driver and would occasionally take me with him to work, since we were poor and couldn't always afford a babysitter or find one that would work nights. So, I would sit in the front seat and his fare would sit in the back like normal. This one night this sketchy white guy gets in the car and starts telling my dad where to go. After about 15 to 20 minutes, we were in a dark neighborhood with only 3 houses and this guy had us in an empty muddy lot. My dad knew something was up, so he unlocked the doors and kindly told the guy to pay and leave. The guy said, "I don't think so." Pulls out a knife and holds it to my dad's neck and says, "Give me all your money." My dad grabs the guy's hand and yells, "Adorkable honey, get out and call 911." The guy tried to grab me while I jumped out of the car, but I was too quick. I ran to one of the houses and rang the doorbell and banged on the door while yelling, "Call 911. My dad needs help. Call the cops, that guy has a knife." Pointing to the parked cab. I don't remember much after that, except going back to the cab and seeing that my dad had stabbed the guy's hand against the car door. I remember he couldn't move much and was in a lot of pain when the cops arrived. When I was 18, I was working at my local popular pharmacy chain store. One slow night I was talking to one of my regulars when these 2 black dudes walked in the store and flipped the hoods of their jackets up. They walked straight to the cooler aisle with the drinks and just stood there. My regular gave me a look, then I returned, and we continued talking. A few minutes later the guys walked out. My regular looks at them and says those two are up to no good. I can feel it, tells me to have a good night and walks out. 30 seconds later He walks back in and says, "Call the cops, they just robbed a cab driver out here." I called the cops and found out that a string of robberies had been taking place around the area lately. If that wasn't bad enough, a few nights later they came back and held my coworker at gunpoint. I put my 2 weeks in directly after that. Okay, so a few years back me and my friends were really into exploring creepy places and trying to find haunted places. So we go to this creepy church, that is in the middle of a field and gated off. We explored the church, blah blah, nothing creepy, but behind the church there is another fenced off field with a few old, abandoned buildings. So, we hop that fence and go into the barn. A bunch of old furniture, but nothing too creepy. So, we went into the next house. It was an old 2-story with absolutely no furniture or anything except upstairs there was one of those old toy things that look kinda like binoculars, but you click a button, and it cycles through pictures. So, I picked it up and started looking through the pictures. It's all like landmark pictures, but then there was a picture of a lady in a black dress with 2 little girls also in black, in front of a wall staring at the camera. I clicked the button again and it was a zoomed-in picture of her staring straight into the camera, but the girls were gone. I dropped the toy and noped. I will never go back. I don't believe in ghosts, and I don't believe in extraterrestrial visitors, so this story continues to be unexplained. My ex-girlfriend and I used to drive to a makeout spot for some, privacy. This particular evening was exceptionally beautiful with a cloudless, star-filled sky. We were parked on a hill, close to a large field of trees and bushes, and beyond the foliage, the glistening city below. We start in the front seat, making out, hands are everywhere. I used to keep an eye and ear out for other cars since the local sheriff would occasionally drop by, so even with my hand comfortably making its way under my girl's shirt, I made sure I was aware of my surroundings. We always were. I'm leaning into the passenger seat, enjoying a squeeze of double DS, when out of the corner of my eye, I see it. At the hood of my car, carefully and deliberately trying its best to hide and peek, was a glowing, white, man-shaped object. Its hands were apart and resting on the hood and it was lifting itself higher for a better view. Obviously, I freaked out. Without explanation, I throw open the driver's side door and jump outside to address my ghostly peeping Tom. But it was gone. In the bushes, I see the rustling of where it could have gone, and in a wind-free evening, I knew those bushes could only have moved from one thing. So, what did I do? I got back in the car in absolute panic. My jeans were unzipped and flapping around with the jingle of an undone belt. My shirt was unbuttoned, and my seat was fully reclined, but I started the engine and drove away as fast as I could while telling my girlfriend what I had seen and what was happening. She didn't see a thing. I would have thought, hey, I could have been hallucinating or it could have been a figment of my imagination until months later, I was having a conversation with my girlfriend's sister. She tells me that she and her boyfriend were in the woods that same night, drinking, alone. But they also ran away in a panic that evening when they saw a bright ray of light come out of the sky and into the wooded area beyond them. Needless to say, we never went back.
My boyfriend and I decided to go to a secluded hot spring in Idaho. It was March, but there was still a lot of snow on the ground. The hike was only 2 miles in, but the warm humid air made the ground incredibly slick and treacherous. We weren't going to let that stop us. We got to the hot springs, and got naked, soaked, drank wine, smoked weed, etc. We were there for several hours with not another soul in sight. We figured the ground was too treacherous for anyone to try to hike in. Suddenly, we both spot a guy walking up towards the hot springs. We figured he would get in and we would leave. Instead, he climbed up to where we were sitting and started asking us questions like, have you seen any deer or animals? We said no, and that if he wanted to get in we would leave. He would not leave and just kept staring at me. I was still naked. We started getting really uncomfortable and my boyfriend was getting prepared to fight this guy. My boyfriend had a knife, but it was in his backpack, which was several feet away. The guy finally turned away and left, and we quickly got dressed and hiked back out. We still had the uneasy feeling of being watched. In addition, it was not hunting season, nor did this guy have a gun or look like he was prepared for hunting. I honestly thought I was going to be hurt and my boyfriend was going to be murdered. We both were thinking of ways to get out of the situation and how it could have turned out really bad. This isn't exactly creepy, but it's one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me. I was driving down the motorway with my boyfriend in the passenger seat, and my dad in the seat behind me. My dad is an epileptic and his fits are extremely sporadic. Sometimes he goes extremely stiff and other times he will try to get out of place or grab and punch people. Mid-conversation I felt his hands wrap around my throat as I was driving, pulling my head back and making it increasingly difficult to drive. My boyfriend managed to help steer the car into the hard shoulder, but it was one of the scariest experiences in my life. I went through a phase after high school where I thought I wanted to join the military. I met with several recruiters from each branch, but none went so far as the Marine. He came through my line where I was cashiering at my little high school job and left a business card. I called him a day later, and he came to meet me at my house. We did the reading test and the little card game where you put what's least important to you last, leading up to what's most important, and he tells you how the Marines can help you achieve that. I went to his office a town away and toured his little facility where in the back potential candidates met every Tuesday and Thursday to train for PT tests. He came through my line every week or so to check up on me while I was at work. Eventually, I moved away from the idea of the military lifestyle completely after my family and boyfriend gave me grief over it. I saw the Marine in my line later that week and let him know my decision. Then, he started to come to see me every day. Every single day. I don't know if he knew my schedule, or if he just showed up hoping to see me, but every day I worked, I saw him. Everything culminated on a late evening, where I stayed very late as the closing cashier. I had seen the Marine at about 8:30, made small talk, sent him on, worked the rest of my shift and walked out at 10:15 through the employee entrance/exit. He was waiting there. He walked me to my car. He leaned against my car door, blocking me from getting in my car and leaving. He pushed me harder and harder to try to join his branch. I don't know what he saw in me, but he promised me the world. A few employees walked out, and I tried to subtly get their attention, but they ignored me. After about 30 minutes of increasingly creepy talk, I told him that I forgot my jacket in the building and needed to go inside and get it. I started walking toward the entrance, intending to get either the police or our AP team to walk me to my car. As I walked, he handed me his jacket and apologized and told me to get into my car to warm up. I got in my car and tried to hand him his jacket through my window. He told me to wear it, he'll follow me home and get it from me when I get home. I slowly drove out of the parking lot, trying to think of what to do. I was young and didn't know if I should call the police about this guy, whose jacket I'm wearing, following me home. I was very scared. This was a big guy compared to me. With all sorts of formal training, and probably a gun to his hip and most likely in his car. I called my boyfriend and asked him what to do as I drove down the highway with the Marine's headlights in my rear view. He told me to come over to his house. His dad was in the Special Forces, Maroon Berets, or something like that, and would meet me at the front porch with one of his guns. Well, I turned off the highway much earlier than I think the Marine expected and floored it. I don't know if he gave up or just couldn't find me, but when I got to my boyfriend's house his dad was out there, and the Marine wasn't. I stayed the night with my boyfriend and called one of our friends who was a local cop about the situation. He advised us to call the Marine's CO and explain what had happened. The next day I called out of work and called the CO, and also mentioned that I had his jacket. The CO arranged a time for me to meet him at his office when he was sure the Marine wouldn't be there for me to return the jacket. When I arrived, he took the jacket from me and promised me that he would be sending the Marine far, far away from my little town. Probably that little piece of evidence helped seal his fate. Not horribly creepy, but definitely the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in real life.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.